Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, where the galaxy burns in endless war and the laughter of thirsting gods echoes through the warp, there exists a being who has witnessed more than 10,000 years of bloodshed, manipulation, and sorrow. His name is Eldrad Ulthran, and he stands as perhaps the most powerful farseer the Eldari race has ever produced since the catastrophic event known simply as the Fall. To understand Eldrad is to peer into the very heart of what it means to bear the weight of foresight, to see countless futures branching like the limbs of an ancient tree, each path laden with its own particular horrors and fleeting hopes. Imagine, if you will, a figure standing at the edge of an abyss, so vast and terrible that entire civilizations have been swallowed by its darkness. This is where Eldrad Ulthran makes his home. There aboard the craft world Ulthwe, a vast city ship that orbits precariously close to the Eye of Terror itself. That roiling maelstrom of chaos and madness, that wound in reality, where the material universe bleeds into the Imperium, casts its sickly light across the black and bone-white surfaces of his world. Every moment of every day, the servants of the dark gods press against the defenses of Ulthwe, seeking any weakness, any crack through which they might pour their corruption. And there, at the center of this eternal vigil, stands Eldrad. His form is that of an aged Eldari, though age holds different meaning for one such as he. The psychic energy that courses through him has sustained his life far beyond what should be possible. But it has also begun the slow transformation that awaits all farseers who live long enough. Crystallization, they call it. The gradual conversion of flesh into psychic crystal, as if the seer's very being is slowly becoming one with the runes they cast and the visions they perceive. Eldrad's body shows signs of this transformation, glittering patches where skin has given way to something harder, something that exists partially in the material realm and partially in the domain of pure thought. He moves through the halls of Ulthwe with a grace that defies his apparent age, the staff of Ulthamar clutched in one hand. This is no ordinary staff, forged from the purest wraithbone and adorned with the spirit stones of Ulthwe's first seer council. It serves as more than just a walking stick or ceremonial symbol. The staff of Ulthamar forms a hyperspatial link directly to Ulthwe's infinity circuit, that vast psychic repository where the souls of dead Eldari reside, safe from the hunger of she who thirsts. Through this connection, Eldrad can channel power that would drive lesser minds to madness, drawing upon the accumulated wisdom and strength of countless generations. His armor, too, speaks of ages long past. The armor of the last runes bears inscriptions that speak of enduring until the final dying of the light, protective wards of such potency that they have turned aside blows that should have ended his life 1,000 times over. Each rune carved into that armor represents not just protection, but a philosophy, a commitment to stand firm against the darkness, no matter the cost. For Eldrad understands, perhaps better than any other living being, just how close his species stands to the precipice of extinction. But who is Eldrad Ulthran, truly? Is he the savior his people desperately need? The master manipulator who pulls strings across the galaxy to ensure the survival of the Eldari race? Or is he something else entirely? A being so consumed by his visions of possible futures that he has lost sight of the present, sacrificing countless lives in pursuit of outcomes that may never come to pass? The answer, like so many truths in the dark millennium, is not simple. To the Imperium of man, Eldrad is an enigma wrapped in treachery, an alien whose actions have sparked wars that cost millions of human lives. They remember the Second War for Armageddon, orchestrated by his hand to divert an orcish rampage away from the craft worlds. They remember the Sanapan scouring, the Mortis annihilation, the Third Coming of Orion, each a catastrophe that can be traced back to the machinations of Ulthwe's most powerful seer. To humanity, Eldrad Ulthran is proof that the Xenos cannot be trusted, that even when they seem to offer aid, they serve only their own mysterious and ultimately hostile purposes. To other craft worlds, Eldrad represents something more complex. They recognize his power, his incredible foresight that has saved the Eldari race from extinction on numerous occasions. They acknowledge the debt owed to him for warnings that arrived in time to turn aside doom. Yet they also view him with suspicion and sometimes outright hostility. His methods are extreme. His willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone in pursuit of his goals makes even other Farseers uncomfortable, as the exile he suffered at the hands of his own people speaks volumes about how his actions, however well-intentioned, have consequences that even the Eldari cannot always stomach. And to the forces of chaos, those entities and champions who serve the ruinous powers, Eldrad Ulthran is a thorn that has festered for millennia. How many of their plans has he unraveled? How many schemes has his foresight allowed the Eldari to counter before they could fully develop? Even Abaddon the Despoiler, War Master of Chaos and architect of 13 Black Crusades, knows Eldrad's name. Their confrontation on the world of Andante IV ended with Abaddon's escape, but not before Eldrad realized a terrible truth. The vision came to him clearly in that moment, the knowledge that his own end drew near. That the threads of fate were converging toward a point where even his considerable power might not be enough. Yet here he remains, millennia after that dire prophecy, still manipulating events, still casting his runes to divine the paths ahead. The crystallization advances slowly, far more slowly than it should. Some whisper that Eldrad has found ways to delay the inevitable transformation, drawing on forbidden knowledge or making bargains that no other Farseer would dare consider. Others believe that his sheer force of will, combined with his unmatched psychic power, simply refuses to submit to a fate he deems unacceptable, while his people still face extinction. His influence extends far beyond the borders of Ulthwé. Throughout the galaxy, events unfold according to patterns that Eldrad set in motion decades or even centuries ago. Yet the human commander makes a decision that seems inspired by sudden intuition, not knowing that an Eldari ranger whispered suggestions into dreams weeks before. An Orcish warlord attacks a world that seems strategically insignificant, not realizing that this diversion prevents them from discovering a hidden maiden world, where Eldari refugees have taken shelter. A merchant vessel's navigation system malfunctions at precisely the right moment to delay a military convoy, buying time for an Eldari war host to complete their mission and vanish back into the webway. These are the methods of Eldrad Ulthran. Where other species wage war with armies and fleets, he wages war with probability and possibility. He sees the skein of fate, that vast and impossibly complex weave of cause and effect that connects all things. And he plucks at individual threads with surgical precision. Sometimes a single death, carefully arranged, can prevent millions more. Sometimes steering an enemy toward a particular battlefield ensures they will clash with another foe, weakening both and leaving the Eldari unmolested. It is a game played on a scale that few can comprehend, with stakes that could not be higher. But the weight of such foresight is not borne lightly. Every vision of the future that Eldrad receives comes with the knowledge of all the suffering, all the death, all the anguish that will accompany that particular path. He sees mothers weeping over dead children, worlds burning under orbital bombardment, entire species driven to extinction by forces they cannot hope to defeat, and he must choose which futures are acceptable, which horrors must be allowed to unfold, because preventing them would lead to even worse outcomes, which lives can be sacrificed and which must be saved. Imagine bearing that burden for a single year, the constant awareness of tragedies you could prevent but must not, because your actions would only make things worse. Now imagine bearing it for a decade, a century, a millennium, 10,000 years of watching civilizations rise and fall, of seeing patterns repeat themselves across the ages, of knowing with absolute certainty what will happen if you do nothing and what might happen if you intervene. This is the existence of Eldrad Ulthran, and it is a torment that would have broken lesser beings long ago. Perhaps this is why he seems so cold to those who interact with him. Not cruel exactly, but distant. as if the part of him that once felt simple compassion has been worn away by the weight of ages and the terrible knowledge he carries. When he looks at another being, he does not see them as they are. He sees them as they might become, as they will become, as they could become, if only certain variables change. He sees the myriad versions of them scattered across possible futures, and he must calculate which version serves the survival of his species best. Yet for all his apparent emotional distance, there are moments when something else shows through. When he guided the survivors of Cadia through the webway after the world's destruction during the 13th Black Crusade, witnesses reported that he seemed almost sad. When he led the rituals to awaken Inead, the god of the dead that represents the Eldari's last desperate hope for survival, there was a weight to his words that spoke of more than just the mechanics of the ceremony. And when 3 of Ulthway's finest farseers crystallized completely during the ritual that opened a path for the Inari, some say they saw something in Eldrad's eyes that might have been grief. His name, Eldrad Ulthran, carries meaning in the Eldari tongue. The first of Ulthway, some translate it. Others interpret it as the foremost, a recognition of his position not just as High Farseer, but as perhaps the greatest living practitioner of the prophetic arts. His original name was Eldrad Nuirasha, but that was before, in a time when he was not yet the figure he has become. The transformation from Nuirasha to Ulthran marked more than just a change in title. It marked the moment when an individual Eldari became something larger, something that would echo through history long after his physical form had finally succumbed to crystallization. In the chronicles kept by the Craftworlds, Eldrad's achievements read like legend. He has broken titans, those massive war machines that tower over battlefields like metal gods. He has boiled the blood of demons with his psychic might, sending them screaming back to the warp from whence they came. He has slain kings and heroes without number, sometimes in personal combat, sometimes by ensuring they walk into traps of their own making, sometimes simply by whispering the right words to the right person at precisely the right moment. His tactical acumen, honed over thousands of years, has saved entire craftworlds from destruction. But achievements alone do not define him. It is his failures, his compromises, his willingness to accept terrible costs in pursuit of necessary goals that truly reveal the nature of Eldrad Ulthran. Every victory has been bought with sacrifice. Every success carries the shadow of what was lost to achieve it. And as the 41st Millennium draws toward whatever conclusion awaits it, as the galaxy tears itself apart, and the Great Rift splits reality itself, Eldrad continues his endless work, manipulating, planning, hoping against hope that somewhere in the infinite branches of possibility, there exists a future where his people might survive. This, then, is Eldrad Ulthran. Not merely the oldest living Eldari, though he is certainly that. Not simply the most powerful Farseer, though few would dispute that claim. He is the embodiment of his species' desperate struggle for survival, the living representation of their refusal to accept extinction, even as the universe itself seems determined to grind them into dust. He is hope and despair intertwined, wisdom and arrogance in equal measure, the prophet who sees tomorrow, and the manipulator who shapes it. His story is not one of clear heroes and villains. It is a story of impossible choices made in the face of apocalyptic threats, of a being trying to save his entire species by any means necessary, regardless of the cost to himself or others. It is a story that began long before the Imperium of Man rose to dominance, and it will likely continue long after the current galactic order has crumbled to ash. For Eldrad Ulthran has stared into the abyss for 10,000 years, and the abyss, despite all its power, has not yet managed to stare him down. The patterns of psychoreactive wraithbone runes that cover his cloak and armor tell stories of their own, each symbol representing not just protection or power, but moments of decision. forks in the road of fate where Eldrad chose one path over another. Some runes commemorate victories, battles won against impossible odds. Others mark failures, times when even his foresight could not prevent disaster. And still others represent mysteries, visions he has seen but not yet come to pass, futures that wait in potential to be realized or averted, depending on choices not yet made. When Eldrad casts his runes to divine the future, it is an act that combines artistry with mathematics, intuition with rigorous discipline. Whilst the thousands of different runes at his command each carry specific meanings, specific resonances with particular aspects of reality and possibility. The way they fall, the patterns they form, the relationships between symbols positioned near each other or far apart, all of this creates a kind of language that speaks of futures not yet written. To an outsider, it might look like random chance, bones thrown on the ground, to be interpreted according to whim. But to Eldrad, each casting is a calculation, a systematic exploration of probability and causality that draws on 10,000 years of accumulated experience. He has developed techniques of his own, methods for reading fate that no other farseer has mastered. If the unique runes he has created over his long life allow him to perceive connections and possibilities that remain hidden to other seers. Some of these runes he has shared with the broader community of farseers, contributing to the evolution of their collective practice. Others he keeps to himself, understanding that some knowledge is too dangerous or too personal to disseminate widely. When Eldrad crystallizes completely, these secret techniques will likely be lost, unless he finds a way to pass them on to a successor he deems capable of using them wisely. The question of succession troubles many who understand Eldrad's importance. Who could possibly replace him? What farseer among the current generation possesses even a fraction of his power and experience? The answer, uncomfortable as it is, appears to be that no one can truly replace Eldrad Ulthran. When he is finally gone, the Eldari will simply have to adapt to a reality where their greatest seer no longer guides them, where decisions must be made without the benefit of his unprecedentedly clear visions, where manipulations must be attempted by those whose skill at such things pales in comparison to his. Some among the younger seers have attempted to study Eldrad's methods, to learn from observation what he will not explicitly teach. They watch how he interacts with other species, how he plants suggestions that will bear fruit years or decades later, how he arranges seemingly insignificant events that cascade into outcomes of tremendous significance. But watching is not the same as understanding, and understanding is not the same as having the power and confidence to implement similar strategies yourself. Eldrad's methods require not just technical skill, but a kind of ruthless calculation that most Eldari, even other farseers, find difficult to maintain consistently. There is also the question of whether anyone should even try to replicate Eldrad's approach. His methods have achieved remarkable successes, yes, but they have also created tremendous resentment and distrust. The Imperium of Man views all Eldari with suspicion, but they reserve special hatred for Eldrad specifically, recognizing him as the architect of manipulations that have cost human lives by the millions. Other Xenos species who have found themselves on the wrong end of his schemes harbor similar grudges. Even among other Eldari, yet there are many who believe that Eldrad's willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone in pursuit of species survival represents a kind of moral decay, a loss of the values that once made their civilization great. Perhaps a successor to Eldrad should not try to be another Eldrad. Perhaps what the Eldari need, once he is gone, is not another master manipulator operating from the shadows, but a leader who can unite the disparate factions of their species through inspiration rather than manipulation. The Inari, with Ivrain as Inead's herald, represent one possibility along these lines. A charismatic figurehead, blessed by a god, calling the Eldari to action rather than subtly steering them toward it through invisible hands. Time will tell whether that approach proves more or less effective than Eldrad's methods. But it certainly offers a different vision of leadership. The physical toll that 10,000 years has taken on Eldrad becomes more apparent each time another Eldari interacts with him. His movements, while still graceful, sometimes show a hesitation that was not present in earlier centuries, as if his mind must consciously direct what was once automatic. His voice carries harmonics that suggest sound traveling through crystalline structures, giving his words a quality that is simultaneously beautiful and unsettling. When he handles objects, there is occasionally a slight clicking sound, crystal touching crystal, that serves as an audible reminder of his ongoing transformation. Yet for all these signs of deterioration, for all the evidence that the crystallization is advancing toward its inevitable conclusion, Eldrad's mind remains sharp. His visions, if anything, have grown more powerful rather than less so, as if the very transformation that is claiming his body somehow enhances his ability to perceive the future. This suggests that the relationship between physical form and psychic ability may not be straightforward, that the crystallization might actually be a kind of metamorphosis rather than simple decay. Perhaps the crystal seers, those fully crystallized farseers who exist in a state between life and death, retain powers that are simply different from those possessed by flesh and blood seers, rather than being objectively diminished. If this is true, then Eldrad's eventual complete crystallization might not represent an ending, so much as a transformation into a new kind of existence. He would join the ranks of the crystal seers. Yes, those ancient beings who advise current farseers through psychic communion, who provide access to wisdom accumulated across ages. In a sense, he would become immortal, his consciousness preserved indefinitely within the crystalline matrix, able to continue guiding his people, albeit in a more limited capacity than he possesses, while still capable of movement and action. But immortality of consciousness is not the same as life, and Eldrad has spent 10,000 years living, acting, shaping events with his own hands rather than merely advising others. The transition from active agent to passive advisor, no matter how wise that advisor might be, represents a loss. It means surrendering control, accepting that others will make the crucial decisions, trusting that those who come after him will have the wisdom and courage to do what is necessary. For a being who has spent millennia taking personal responsibility for his species' survival, this surrender might be the hardest thing of all. Perhaps that is why he has delayed crystallization for so long, far beyond the point where other farseers have succumbed to the transformation. It is not just about preserving his own life, but about maintaining his ability to act, to intervene, to make the difficult choices that he believes only he has the strength to make. Every year he delays represents another year where he remains able to manipulate events directly, another year where his visions can be translated into action without the need to convince others to act on his behalf. The irony is that this very determination to continue, this refusal to accept limitations that other farseers consider inevitable, may be contributing to his isolation from the broader Eldari community. They see in him something that is no longer quite Eldari, a being who has become so focused on species survival that he has lost touch with what makes life worth living for individuals. His willingness to sacrifice anything, including his own humanity, or whatever the Eldari equivalent might be, in pursuit of cold survival strikes many as wrong, even if they cannot articulate exactly why it troubles them. There is a philosophical debate that occasionally surfaces among Eldari scholars about whether survival at any cost is truly survival or something else. If the Eldari manage to endure but only by surrendering everything that made their civilization worthwhile, and if they become creatures of pure calculation without art or joy or spontaneity, have they actually survived in any meaningful sense? Or have they simply prolonged an existence that has become empty of value? Eldrad represents one extreme answer to this question. Survival is paramount. Everything else is secondary, and future generations can worry about rebuilding a culture worth having once the species is secure. But not all Eldari agree with this prioritization. Some argue that the Eldari should hold on to their values even if it makes survival harder, that there are some prices too high to pay, that becoming monsters in order to survive makes survival itself pointless. This debate plays out in the tensions between different factions, in the arguments about whether Eldrad's exile was just or necessary, as in discussions about whether the Inari represent hope or just another form of desperation. Eldrad himself has little patience for such philosophical debates. From his perspective, shaped by 10,000 years of making impossible choices and bearing responsibility for outcomes that affect millions, such discussions are luxuries that a dying species cannot afford. Philosophy can wait for a time when the Eldari are secure. First, they must ensure there will be a time when the Eldari still exist to engage in philosophical reflection. Everything else is secondary to that fundamental imperative. This attitude makes him effective as a strategist and protector, but also makes him difficult to connect with on a personal level. How do you have a conversation with someone who fundamentally does not believe that conversation is important compared to survival? How do you convince someone who has seen futures where entire craft worlds burn that your individual concerns matter enough to be considered alongside species-level imperatives? The answer is that mostly you do not. Eldrad operates on a scale and timeline that makes individual relationships seem ephemeral and unimportant. And while he probably does not intend this as callousness, the effect is much the same. The younger Eldari who interact with Eldrad often comment on this disconnect. They bring him problems that seem enormous to them, crises in their personal lives, or concerns about their craft world's immediate situation. And he responds with advice that addresses the surface issue, while clearly caring more about how their situation affects broader patterns and long-term outcomes. It is like consulting an oracle who can see the future but cannot quite remember what it feels like to live in the present, to have concerns that exist on a human, or Eldari, timescale, rather than a civilizational one. Yet despite this emotional distance, despite the sense that Eldrad operates on a level removed from normal Eldari existence, there remains something compelling about him. When he speaks, even those who distrust his methods listen. When he issues warnings, even those who resent his influence take them seriously. This is partly because of his track record, the demonstrated accuracy of his visions and the effectiveness of his strategies. But it is also something more intangible, a quality of presence that comes from being a being who has truly seen things that others can only imagine, who carries within him knowledge of futures that might be. As the Great Rift continues to tear reality apart, as demonic incursions become more frequent and more devastating, as the established order of the galaxy crumbles and new threats emerge from the darkness, Eldrad's warnings take on new urgency. The catastrophes he has long predicted are arriving faster than even he expected. The Imperium is fragmenting. Chaos is ascendant. The Tyrannid hive fleets continue their inexorable advance from beyond the galactic rim. The Necrons awaken from their millions-year slumber and reclaim the galaxy they believe is rightfully theirs. And through it all, the Eldari decline continues. Each generation slightly smaller than the last, each craft world slightly more vulnerable to the threats that surround them. In this context, Eldrad's methods, however extreme they may seem, begin to look less like the paranoid overreactions of an ancient being losing perspective, and more like reasonable responses to genuine existential threats. Perhaps sacrificing millions of human lives to redirect an orcish green tide really is justified, when the alternative is Eldari extinction. Perhaps manipulating events to trigger wars between other species really is acceptable when it weakens enemies who would otherwise threaten the craft worlds. Perhaps the ends really do justify the means, when the ends in question are the survival of an entire species, and the means, however terrible, are less terrible than the alternative. Or perhaps not, as perhaps there are lines that should not be crossed, prices that are too high to pay, methods that taint whatever outcomes they achieve. The debate continues, and will likely continue long after Eldrad has crystallized and taken his place among the crystal seers. What is undeniable is that he has had an impact on galactic history that few beings can match, that his manipulations have shaped events across millennia, that his vision and determination have saved his people from extinction on numerous occasions. And now, as we prepare to delve deeper into specific periods and events in Eldrad's life, as we examine the fall that shaped his species, the Horus Heresy, where he attempted to save humanity despite their ignorance of his efforts, the Battle of Port Demesnes, where he tried to awaken a god, and all the other crucial moments that define his legend, we should remember that this is not just a story about an alien seer in a science fiction setting. It is a story about bearing impossible burdens, about making choices when all options are terrible, about trying to save something worth saving in a universe that seems determined to destroy everything of value. It is a story about the weight of foresight, the burden of knowledge, and the terrible responsibility that comes with having the power to see possible futures and the will to try to shape which of those futures becomes reality. It is a story about sacrifice and compromise, about victories that taste like defeat, and defeats that somehow contain the seeds of eventual triumph. And most fundamentally, it is a story about refusing to surrender. That's about standing firm against the darkness, even when all hope seems lost. About fighting for survival, not because victory is certain, but because the alternative is unacceptable. This is the story of Eldrad Ulthran, the oldest living Eldari in Warhammer 40k, and it is a story worth telling and remembering. So let us continue our exploration of this complex figure, examining the events that shaped him and the choices he has made across his impossibly long existence, seeking to understand not just what he has done, but why he has done it, and what his example might teach us about leadership, survival, and the heavy cost of caring too much about the future to fully live in the present. Eldrad, the oldest living, Eldar, in Warhammer 40k, Part 2, the Battle of Port Demesnes, a desperate gambit continued, had completed their crystallization, but whose consciousness remained active within their transformed forms, already existed in a state between flesh and pure psychic energy. They would serve as the perfect medium for the massive undertaking Eldrad envisioned. Through them, he would temporarily connect all the infinity circuits across the galaxy, creating a psychic beacon of such magnitude that it would dwarf even the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that guided Imperial vessels through the warp. This beacon would serve a dual purpose. First, it would focus the accumulated psychic energy of millions of Eldari souls into a single point in reality, creating conditions that might allow Yniad's consciousness to coalesce and awaken, at least partially. Second, it would call out across the Imperium to wherever Yniad's nascent spirit resided, providing a path for that divine essence to flow from the abstract realm of possibility into concrete existence. The moon of Coheria, with its surface composed of naturally occurring psychoreactive crystal, would serve as the focal point, a place where the barrier between material and immaterial was already thin enough to make such a monumental working feasible. But the risks were extraordinary, perhaps even suicidal. Every craft world in the galaxy would have its infinity circuit temporarily hijacked for this purpose, as their carefully maintained networks of preserved souls suddenly repurposed as components in Eldrad's grand ritual. During the time the connection was active, those craft worlds would be vulnerable, their psychic defenses weakened, their wraithbone infrastructure essentially offline. Any attack during that window could prove catastrophic. Worse, the massive psychic beacon would be visible across vast stretches of the galaxy, a flare of energy that would draw attention from entities that the Eldari absolutely did not want to attract. The Astronomicon would be disrupted, thrown off course by the sheer magnitude of psychic energy being channeled through the ritual. Imperial ships across entire sectors would find themselves suddenly adrift, their navigators blinded or driven mad by the unexpected interference. Fleets would be thrown off course, military operations disrupted, chaos spreading through the Imperium's already strained infrastructure. The human cost would be measured in millions of lives, perhaps more. And if Slaanesh detected what was happening, If she who thirsts realized that her prey was attempting to birth a god specifically designed to destroy her, the Dark Prince's response would be swift and merciless. Eldrad understood all of these risks. He had foreseen them in painful detail, had watched countless futures branch from the moment when the ritual began, some ending in triumph, but far more ending in disaster. But he had also seen the alternative futures, the timelines where the Eldari simply continued their slow decline toward extinction, and those visions left him with no choice. The risks of action, however terrible, were preferable to the certainty of doom through inaction. If there was even a chance, however slim, that this desperate gambit might succeed, then it had to be attempted. He began his preparations in secret, working with the Mask of the Midnight Sorrow, a troop of harlequins who served Tegarak, the Laughing God. The harlequins were uniquely positioned to help with this undertaking, as they traveled freely between craft worlds and could move through the webway with ease that other Eldari could not match. More importantly, they understood the value of secrets, of misdirection, of presenting one performance to the audience while the real work happened behind the scenes.
You know, I've been covering Warhammer lore for quite a while, and honestly, Eldrad fascinates me in a way that few characters do. Here's someone who's literally older than the Imperium itself, who's seen empires rise and fall, and yet he's still out there making moves. What really gets me is that he's not some all-powerful deity or unkillable demon. He's just an extremely skilled Eldar who refuses to die. And that crystallization, that slow transformation he's fighting against, it's like watching someone race against time itself. Every decision he makes carries this weight because you know he's running out of time. Even if that running out spans centuries, it makes his ruthlessness feel more desperate than evil, if that makes sense. Anyway, let's get back to the video.
Together with the death jester known as Imperium's Spectre, Eldrad arranged a series of heists and carefully orchestrated raids that would gather the crystallized farseers he needed without alerting the craft worlds to his true purpose. The heists themselves became legends in their own right. Harlequin troops would arrive at a craft world, ostensibly to perform one of their traditional renditions of the Fall, the tragic story of how the Eldari's arrogance and excess had birthed Slaanesh and doomed their species. But this particular performance was unlike the traditional cycle. It ended not with Slaanesh and Shagorach locked in eternal combat, but with hints of something new. Whispers of a god yet to come who might break the stalemate and offer salvation. The performances captivated audiences across multiple craft worlds, becoming fashionable among the Asuryani, who appreciated the fresh perspective on their people's greatest tragedy. But while audiences watched the dance and heard the songs, members of the troupe slipped away into the depths of each craft world, making their way to the chambers where crystal seers were kept. These crystallized farseers, revered as sources of wisdom and guidance, were carefully removed and transported through the webway to Coheria, where Eldrad prepared the site for his great working. The thefts were discovered eventually, of course, but by then the perpetrators had vanished, and the various craft worlds had no way of knowing that this was a coordinated effort rather than isolated incidents. The moon of Coheria itself was an unusual place, its entire surface composed of a mineral that resonated with psychic energy in ways that normal matter did not. Walking across its crystalline landscape was like moving through a frozen dream, where thoughts took on substance and the boundary between mind and reality grew dangerously thin. It was perfect for Eldrad's purposes, a natural amplifier that would enhance the ritual's power and help focus the massive energies he planned to channel. He established his ritual site in a vast crater, arranging the stolen crystal seers in a specific geometric pattern, each positioned to serve as a node in the network he was constructing. The Harlequins helped with these preparations, their natural grace and psychic sensitivity making them ideal assistants for work that required such precision. But even they grew uneasy as the scope of what Eldrad intended became clear. This was not just a powerful ritual or an ambitious working of psychic might. This was an attempt to fundamentally alter the cosmic order, it to bring into being something that had never existed before and might never have existed without this intervention. The Harlequins served Tzegorak, the trickster god who delighted in chaos and unpredictability, but even they understood that there were limits to how far one should push against the fundamental laws of reality. Yet they continued their work, perhaps because they recognized the same desperation that drove Eldrad, the understanding that their species was running out of time and options, or perhaps because Tzegorak himself, watching from whatever realm he inhabited, found the whole affair amusing and wished to see how it would play out. The Laughing God was not known for predictability or for prioritizing safety over entertainment, and Eldrad's desperate gambit certainly promised to be memorable, for good or ill. Meanwhile, Eldrad's preparations had not gone entirely unnoticed by forces beyond the Eldari. The Imperium's Ordo Xenos, the branch of the Inquisition dedicated to monitoring and eliminating alien threats, had been tracking unusual Eldari activity for months. Reports of Harlequin performances at multiple craft worlds, combined with intelligence about thefts of sacred Eldari artifacts, had raised alarms. The Death Watch, the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos, elite space marines drawn from various chapters and trained specifically to fight Xenos threats, began investigating. Captain Artemis, a Death Watch veteran with decades of experience fighting Eldari raiders, took personal command of the investigation. He recognized patterns in the reported activity, saw connections that pointed towards something larger than simple raiding or theft. When his scouts finally located the ritual's site on Coheria and reported what they found, vast arrays of alien technology, dozens of crystallized Xenos psychers arranged in geometric patterns, and psychic energy building to levels that made his force's psychers physically ill, Artemis understood that he was looking at a threat of potentially apocalyptic proportions. The Death Watch struck with the sudden violence that characterized all their operations. Drop pods screamed down from orbit, smashing into Coheria's crystal surface and disgorging squads of power-armored warriors armed with the most advanced anti-Xenos weaponry the Imperium could provide. Artemis himself led the assault, his massive frame, enhanced by Terminator armor, wielding weapons that had ended the existence of countless alien champions over his long career. The Harlequins, more for all their skill and speed, were caught off guard by the ferocity and timing of the attack. Inriam's Spectre, the Death Jester who had been instrumental in gathering the Crystal Seers, fell in the opening moments of the battle, his body torn apart by massed bolter fire before he could bring his own considerable combat abilities to bear. The loss of the Death Jester disrupted the Harlequins' coordination, and though they fought with desperate skill, they were being pushed back, unable to prevent the Death Watch from advancing toward the ritual's center, where Eldrad stood, his attention focused entirely on maintaining the massive psychic working he had already begun. The ritual was incomplete, only partially activated, but already the effects were staggering. Across the galaxy, Craftworld seers felt a sudden pulling sensation, as if their infinity circuits were being drawn towards some distant point. Navigation throughout entire sectors began to fail as the psychic beacon Eldrad was creating interfered with normal warp travel. And in Komora, the dark city of the Drukhari, something unprecedented was happening. A gladiatorial contest was interrupted when one of the combatants, an Eldari corsair named Ivrain, was struck by a mote of divine consciousness, a fragment of Iniad's awakening awareness that had been pulled toward the closest concentration of Eldari souls when Eldrad's ritual was disrupted. For Eldrad himself, the moment the Death Watch attacked was one of the most frustrating in his impossibly long life. He had foreseen many possible futures branching from this moment, many ways the ritual might succeed or fail. But he had not clearly perceived this specific intervention. The presence of the Death Watch should have shown up in his visions, should have been something he could plan around or prevent. Yet somehow, impossibly, they had surprised him. Whether this was due to some property of the stasis bomb they carried, a device designed specifically to disrupt psychic phenomena, or whether it represented a failure of his foresight at the worst possible moment, Eldrad could not immediately determine. What he knew with terrible certainty was that the ritual could not be stopped partway through without catastrophic consequences. The energies he had already unleashed, the connections he had formed between Craftworld infinity circuits and the crystal surface of Coheria, but could not simply be severed without causing psychic backlash that would kill every seer involved and potentially damage the infinity circuits themselves. He had committed to a course of action that now had to be seen through to some kind of conclusion, even if that conclusion was compromised by the Death Watch's interference. Eldrad attempted to reason with Captain Artemis as the Space Marine advanced toward him, trying to explain in the brief moments available that what he was doing served not just Eldari interests, but the broader struggle against chaos. That Inead's awakening would strike a blow against the dark gods that would benefit all species threatened by their depredations. But Artemis, like Fulgrim 10,000 years before him, it was in no mood to listen to alien explanations for actions that looked like a direct threat to the Imperium. From his perspective, Eldrad was conducting some massive Xenos ritual that was disrupting Imperial navigation and threatening human lives across entire sectors. The appropriate response was not negotiation, but immediate termination of the threat. The stasis bomb deployed by the Death Watch was a weapon of last resort, a device that created a bubble of frozen time around its detonation point. When it activated, the ritual collapsed catastrophically. The connections Eldrad had so carefully constructed between crystal seers and infinity circuits snapped like overstressed cables, sending psychic shockwaves rippling back along the pathways toward their sources. The moon of Coheria itself began to fracture, cracks spreading across its crystal surface, as the enormous energies that had been focused there suddenly had nowhere to go. Eldrad, caught at the epicenter of this disaster, diverted a fraction of his concentration to protecting himself from the worst of the backlash. It was a tiny thing, an instinctive preservation reflex that he enacted without conscious thought, but it proved to be a fatal mistake. That tiny diversion of power, that microsecond of attention turned inward rather than outward, created an imbalance in the ritual's carefully calibrated energy flows. The working that should have awakened Inead in full collapsed into something smaller, more fragmentary, but still powerful enough to have effects that would ripple across the galaxy. Instead of the full awakening Eldrad had planned, Inead achieved only partial consciousness and a sliver of divine awareness rather than complete apotheosis. That fragment of godhood reached out desperately, searching for an anchor point, and found Ivrain in Komorrah. The transformation that followed was explosive in every sense. The birth of the first Inari, Eldari dedicated to the service of the nascent god of the dead. The resulting psychic disruption tore through the Dark City, creating what the Drukhari would come to call the Great Disjunction, a catastrophe that nearly destroyed Komorrah and set in motion a chain of events that would fundamentally alter Eldari society. Eldrad managed to escape from Coheria before the moon's final disintegration, using the webway portals he had prepared as emergency exits. But he left behind the bodies of Harlequins who had trusted him, the shattered remnants of crystal seers who had been subjected to forces they were never meant to endure, and the knowledge that his greatest gambit had failed to achieve its intended purpose. Inead was awake, yes, but only partially, possessing a fraction of the power Eldrad had hoped to grant the newborn deity. Whether this partial awakening would be enough to make a difference in the Eldari's struggle against Slaanesh remained to be seen. The aftermath of the Battle of Port Demesnes rippled across the galaxy with effects that would take years to fully manifest. The disruption to the Astronomicon had thrown Imperial fleets off course, resulting in ships emerging from the warp in unexpected locations, sometimes in the midst of enemy territory, sometimes simply disappearing entirely, lost to the vagaries of warp travel without proper navigation. The human cost was indeed measured in millions, entire regiments finding themselves stranded on hostile worlds, naval vessels materializing inside asteroid fields or too close to stars, civilian transports emerging light years from their intended destinations with insufficient fuel to reach safety. The Imperium's response was predictably furious. The Inquisition issued orders for the destruction of any Eldari encountered in Imperial space, making no distinction between Craftworld Asuryani and Drukhari raiders. Several maiden worlds were subjected to exterminatus, their biospheres sterilized in retaliation for Eldrad's actions. The fragile tolerance that had sometimes existed between Imperium and Craftworld forces evaporated, replaced by open hostility that would persist for years. But more significantly for the Eldari themselves, the partial awakening of Iniad and the birth of Ivrain as the god's high priestess created a schism within their society. Some, particularly the young and desperate, saw in the Inari a genuine hope for salvation, a path forward that did not require waiting for total extinction before their god could save them. Others viewed the entire affair as blasphemy, a dangerous perversion of ancient prophecy that might doom them all. The debate became particularly heated on Craftworld Bieltan, where tensions between traditional and progressive factions were already running high. Fracture and exile. The news of what had transpired at Port Demesnes reached Ulthwé through multiple channels, each report adding more details to the picture of what Eldrad had attempted and how spectacularly it had failed to achieve its intended outcome. The Seer Council, that august body of Farseers who had worked alongside Eldrad for centuries, was stunned, not simply by the audacity of the plan itself, though that was shocking enough, but by the fact that he had undertaken it without consulting them, without seeking their counsel or approval. The High Farseer of Ulthwé, the individual whose visions had guided their craft world through countless crises, had acted unilaterally on a matter that affected every Eldari in the galaxy. The council convened an emergency session, summoning Eldrad to account for his actions. He came willingly, making no attempt to hide or evade their questions. He stood before them in the great chamber where they gathered, the staff of Ultimar in his hand, patches of crystallization glittering on his skin, and explained exactly what he had done and why. He spoke of his visions of the Eldari's inevitable decline, of the futures he had foreseen where their species simply faded into extinction, soul by soul, until nothing remained but empty craft worlds, drifting through the void. He described his reasoning, the logic that had led him to conclude that waiting for Iniad's natural awakening was tantamount to accepting extinction, that some action, however desperate, was preferable to passive acceptance of doom. The council listened, and when Eldrad had finished, they deliberated. The debate lasted for hours, Farseers arguing passionately on both sides of the question. Some defended Eldrad, pointing out that his actions, however extreme, had resulted in at least a partial awakening of Iniad, something that had seemed impossible before. Others condemned him, focusing on the costs, the lives lost among the Harlequins who had aided him, the crystal seers who had been destroyed or damaged by the ritual's collapse, the consequences for Eldari relations with the Imperium, and most damningly, the risks he had taken with every craft world's infinity circuit without seeking permission from their respective seer councils. But it was not just the Port Demesnes incident that the council judged. Reports had been arriving from other craft worlds, particularly from Bieltan, where Eldrad's subsequent actions had led to even more controversial outcomes. As when Ivrain and her newly formed Inari arrived at Bieltan seeking shelter and support, they found the craft world under assault by demonic forces that had followed them through the webway. The invasion threatened to overwhelm Bieltan's defenses and, more critically, to corrupt the craft world's infinity circuit, damning millions of souls to eternal torment. Eldrad, recognizing the crisis, had acted to save the craft world by opening a hyperspatial bridge through the warp, connecting Ulthwé's crystal seers to those of Bieltan to create a pathway through which the Inari could escape and bring aid. It was a dangerous undertaking, turning the crystal seers away from their normal duties within the infinity circuits and exposing them to potential warp corruption. The ritual required to create such a bridge involved psychic forces that stretched the capabilities of even the most skilled Farseers, and Eldrad had done it without explicit authorization. acting on his own authority because time was critical and consultation would have meant delay. The bridge worked. The Inari escaped through it, and in doing so, they drew the demonic forces away from Bieltan's infinity circuit, preventing the catastrophic corruption that would have destroyed the craft world. But the cost was terrible. 3 of Ulthui's finest farseers, seers who had served the craft world for centuries, crystallized completely during the ritual. Their consciousness froze in that final moment of exertion, leaving them as statues rather than the slowly crystallizing but still mobile figures they had been. For all practical purposes, they were dead. Their ability to serve the craft world ended, their wisdom lost except for whatever could be extracted through communion with their crystal forms. Moreover, the psychic bridge had created a massive disturbance in the warp, a translocation wave that affected Imperial ships across multiple sectors. Geller fields failed, vessels were torn from their intended courses, and entire fleets found themselves displaced by light years. The human cost, added to the casualties from Port de Mesnes, made Eldrad's recent actions responsible for more Imperial deaths than some entire wars had produced. The Imperium would not forget, would not forgive, and their retaliation would fall not just on Eldrad, but on all Eldari they encountered. Additionally, Eldrad's actions had, in a sense, doomed Bieltan. Not directly, but through the chain of events he had set in motion. The demonic assault, the subsequent birth of the Incarnate, the avatar of Iniad that manifested during the crisis, and the massive psychic energies unleashed during these events had fractured the craft world structure. Bieltan, once one of the mightiest craft worlds, found itself broken, split into multiple pieces that could no longer form a cohesive whole. The survivors would continue, but the craft world as it had existed for millennia was gone, destroyed as a direct consequence of Eldrad's manipulations. The Seer Council's judgment, when it finally came, was not unanimous, but the majority was clear. Eldrad Ulthran had committed grave crimes against his own people and against the broader Eldari civilization. He had stolen crystal seers from multiple craft worlds without permission, and he had conducted a ritual that put every infinity circuit in the galaxy at risk. He had caused the crystallization of 3 Ulthui farseers through his reckless actions. He had damaged Eldari relations with the Imperium beyond any hope of repair for generations, and he had shown wayward arrogance in all of this, acting as if his visions and his judgment superseded the collective wisdom of all Eldari seers combined. For these crimes, Eldrad Ulthran was formally exiled from Craftworld Ulthwe. He would no longer hold the position of High Farseer. He would not be permitted to reside within Ulthwe's halls or to participate in the Seer Council's deliberations. He was cast out from the people he had served for 10,000 years, declared persona non grata by the very craftworld that had been his home since before the Imperium existed. The sentence was delivered with great solemnity, and though some members of the council wept as they pronounced it, none spoke against the judgment. Eldrad accepted his exile without protest. He had known it was coming, had seen this possibility in his visions, and prepared himself for it. Perhaps he even agreed that it was necessary, that the Seer Council needed to demonstrate to the other craft worlds that they did not condone his methods, that Ulthwe was not responsible for the chaos he had unleashed. Or perhaps he simply recognized that arguing would be pointless, that the decision was made and no words of his would change it. He departed Ulthwe quietly, taking with him only the staff of Ulthamar, his armor, his personal effects, and the knowledge that he had become what he had perhaps always been destined to become, an outsider, a being whose vision and methods were too extreme even for his own people. But he did not leave alone. A number of Ulthwe Eldari, particularly younger seers and warriors, who had been inspired by his willingness to take action, rather than simply accept slow decline, chose to follow him into exile. They became known as the Exiles, a faction dedicated to continuing Eldrad's work of supporting the Inari and seeking the full awakening of Iniad through whatever means proved necessary. Yvraine herself spoke in Eldrad's defense during the trial, arguing that without his intervention, Bieltan would have fallen completely, that the partial awakening of Iniad represented genuine hope where none had existed before, that his methods might be extreme, but the situation facing the Eldari was equally extreme. Her words carried weight, given that she had been chosen by Iniad itself as the god's high priestess, but they were not enough to prevent the exile. The Seer Council's decision stood, and Eldrad was cast out. The exile marked a turning point in Eldrad's incredibly long life. For the first time in 10 millennia, he was not operating from a position of official authority. He was no longer High Farseer, no longer had automatic access to Ulthui's resources and military forces, no longer could simply issue commands and expect them to be obeyed. This might have broken a lesser being, but Eldrad adapted with the same flexibility that had allowed him to survive and thrive across centuries of change. If he could not lead from within the established power structure, he would lead from outside it. If official channels were closed to him, but he would work through unofficial ones. His exile, rather than diminishing his influence, in some ways enhanced it. Free from the political constraints that came with being High Farseer of a major craft world, Eldrad could operate more freely, could take actions that would have been impossible if he had needed to maintain the support of the Seer Council. He became a wanderer, moving through the webway with the exiles who had chosen to follow him, appearing when and where he was needed, offering his counsel to those willing to listen, and continuing his work of manipulating events toward outcomes he believed would benefit the Eldari species. The Inari became his primary focus, and he saw in Yvraine and her followers the best hope for achieving what his ritual at Port Domenus had failed to accomplish: the full awakening of Iniad and the defeat of Slaanesh. The Inari spoke of something they called the Seventh Path, a method of awakening their god without requiring the extinction of the Eldari species. This path involved gathering the 5 Croneswords, ancient artifacts that had been scattered across the galaxy when Slaanesh was born, weapons of tremendous power that could theoretically be used to achieve full apotheosis for Iniad. Eldrad knew the legend of the Croneswords, had studied it during his centuries of research into methods for dealing with the Slaanesh threat. The swords were real, or at least had been real at one point in the past. Whether they still existed, whether they retained the power attributed to them, whether they could actually accomplish what the Inari hoped, these remained open questions. But the Seventh Path represented a concrete plan, a specific goal to work toward, and that was infinitely preferable to the passive waiting that had characterized Eldari strategy for too long. So Eldrad lent his knowledge and his foresight to the Inari cause. He advised Yvraine on which paths to take, warned her of dangers that lay ahead, helped coordinate between the Inari and other Eldari factions who might be persuaded to support them. He used his still considerable influence among certain craft-world seers to smooth the way for Inari diplomatic efforts, to ensure that Yvraine's followers received at least a hearing rather than being immediately rejected as heretics and blasphemers. But even among the Inari, Eldrad remained somewhat apart. He supported their cause, yes, but he did not fully join them, did not commit himself to Iniad with the fervor that characterized true believers like Yvraine or the Vizarch. Perhaps after 10,000 years of serving his people in his own way, according to his own visions, he was simply incapable of subordinating himself to another's leadership, even a leader chosen by a god. Or perhaps he maintained his independence because his foresight showed him possibilities that the Inari's faith blinded them to, futures where their quest for the Croneswords led to disaster rather than salvation. During the 13th Black Crusade, that massive chaos assault led by Abaddon, the Despoiler, which would culminate in the destruction of Cadia and the opening of the Great Rift, Eldrad continued his work from the shadows. He dispatched Harlequin Shadowseers to aid Imperial forces at crucial moments, not out of any love for humanity, but because the alternative, Chaos victory across the entire sector, would threaten Eldari interests. He guided Inari strike forces to targets that would weaken Chaos while strengthening the Seventh Path's chances of success. And when Cadia finally fell, when the pylons that had held back the Eye of Terror for millennia were destroyed, and the warp spilled across the galaxy in the phenomenon that would become known as the Great Rift, Eldrad was there on the planet Calissus, guiding Imperial survivors through the webway to safety. Among those survivors were figures who would prove crucial to the galaxy's future, or individuals whom Eldrad's foresight had identified as important to outcomes that stretched decades or centuries ahead. His manipulation of events to ensure their survival was subtle enough that the humans involved never realized they were being guided, never understood that their seemingly fortunate escape was anything but fortunate coincidence. This was Eldrad at his finest, working behind the scenes to influence outcomes while leaving no evidence of his involvement. The opening of the Great Rift transformed the galaxy, splitting it nearly in half with a massive warp storm that made travel and communication across the divide nearly impossible. For the Imperium, it was a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. For the Eldari, it was something more complex. The rift brought new dangers, yes, but it also brought new opportunities. What the weakening of the barrier between material and immaterial made certain psychic workings easier to accomplish. The chaos it created among humanity and other species meant they would be too distracted to interfere with Eldari plans. And perhaps most importantly, the sheer scope of the disaster had finally convinced even the most conservative craftworld seers that waiting passively for things to improve was no longer a viable strategy. In this new reality, Eldrad's exile from Ulthwé began to seem less relevant. He was not officially forgiven, not welcomed back to the Seer Council with apologies and restoration of his former position. But when Ulthwé itself came under assault by demonic forces pouring through tears in reality, created by the Great Rift, it was Eldrad who led the exiles to the craftworld's defense. Yet he fought alongside warriors who had cast him out, defended infrastructure he had once overseen, and saved lives that belonged to people who had voted for his exile. The battle was desperate, a grinding fight against demonic legions that seemed endless. But Eldrad's forces, combined with Ulthwé's own defenders, eventually prevailed. The demons were driven back, the tears sealed through massive psychic effort, and Ulthwé survived, though scarred and weakened. In the aftermath, there was a moment when Eldrad and the Seer Council stood facing each other across the same chamber where his exile had been pronounced, and unspoken questions hung in the air. Would his exile be lifted? Would he be welcomed back? Would there be some acknowledgement that perhaps his methods, however extreme, had been proven at least partially correct? But that reconciliation never fully materialized. The Seer Council acknowledged Eldrad's aid, thanked him for his service to the craftworld in its hour of need, but the exile itself remained in place. Too much had happened. Too many consequences from his actions still rippled through Eldari society for there to be a simple return to how things were. Bieltan remained fractured. The crystal seers he had used at Port de Mesnus were still gone. The Imperial retaliation for his disruption of their navigation continued to cost Eldari lives. The Council could accept his help without fully forgiving the crimes that had led to his exile. Eldrad seemed unsurprised by this half measure, this acceptance of his aid without restoration of his status. Perhaps he had foreseen it. Perhaps he had even preferred it. And as full restoration would have come with expectations and obligations that would have constrained his ability to operate independently. As an exile who occasionally aided his former craftworld, he could maintain freedom of action while still serving Ulthwé's interests when they aligned with his own goals. It was not the position of respect and authority he had once held, but it was, in its own way, more honest about the reality of his situation. The craftworld now found itself divided into 3 rough factions, each with different visions for how the Eldari should navigate the new reality created by the Great Rift. The Seer Council represented the traditional approach, using foresight to guide Ulthwé through dangers while maintaining the old ways and old alliances. The Exiles, led by Eldrad, focused on supporting the Inari and pursuing the Seventh Path as the best hope for salvation. And then there were those Eldari of Ulthwé who had fully joined the Inari themselves, who had left the craftworld entirely to follow Ivrain and serve Inia directly. This division created tensions that would simmer for years, occasionally erupting into open conflict as different factions pursued contradictory goals. But it also created a kind of resilience through diversity, with 3 different groups working toward Eldari survival through 3 different methods. The species' chances of finding a path forward were arguably better than if everyone had committed to a single approach. Eldrad understood this, recognized the value of multiple strategies being pursued simultaneously, even if those strategies sometimes worked at cross purposes. His relationship with the Inari themselves became more complex over time. Initially, he had been one of their strongest supporters, lending his considerable knowledge and foresight to their cause. But as years passed and the quest for the Croneswords continued without clear success, Eldrad began to drift away from the movement. He still supported them, still offered aid when asked, but he no longer committed himself fully to their cause. His visions showed him futures where Yvrain's growing desperation led her to take risks that endangered not just herself, but everyone who followed her. He saw timelines where the search for the Croneswords became an obsession that blinded the Inari to other opportunities and dangers. Most troublingly, as Eldrad perceived that Yvrain was becoming increasingly willing to sacrifice anything and anyone in pursuit of her goal. The irony was not lost on him, this criticism coming from one who had spent 10,000 years doing exactly that. Perhaps that was why he could see it so clearly in her, recognize the warning signs of someone whose focus on a single objective was causing them to lose perspective on everything else. He had walked that path himself, knew where it led, and had the scars, both literal and metaphorical, to prove it. So Eldrad maintained his distance, offering counsel but not commitment, providing aid but reserving the right to disagree with Yvrain's decisions. This frustrated some of the Inari, who saw in Eldrad a powerful potential ally who refused to fully embrace their cause. But it also meant that when Yvrain did make mistakes, when her desperation did lead her into traps or dangerous situations, Eldrad was often positioned to help extract her from the consequences, precisely because he had maintained enough independence to see the problems she was creating for herself. The exile that had once seemed like a punishment, a rejection by the people he had served so long, had become something else entirely. Freedom. Freedom to operate without official constraints. Freedom to support multiple factions and causes simultaneously. Freedom to adapt his methods as circumstances changed. Eldrad Ulthran, no longer High Farseer of Ulthwé, had perhaps become more effective at serving his species, precisely because he was no longer bound by the responsibilities and limitations that official position entailed. It was a strange kind of liberation, bitter in some ways, but ultimately necessary for the work that still lay ahead. The Inari and the Seventh Path. The partial awakening of Inead during the disaster at Port Demesnes had consequences that rippled far beyond what even Eldrad's considerable foresight had anticipated. In the dark city of Comorach, that impossible realm existing within the webway, where the Drukhari practiced their dark arts, something unprecedented had occurred. Yvrain, a corsair turned gladiator who had walked many paths in her long life, was struck by a fragment of divine consciousness in the arena called the Crucible. In that moment, as blades sought her life and crowds screamed for blood, she died and was reborn as something new, the herald of Inead, the emissary of the god of the dead, a high priestess of a deity that was only partially awake, but unmistakably real. The transformation was explosive, reality itself seeming to crack and shatter around her as divine power flooded into mortal form. The demonic entities that the Drukhari had inadvertently allowed into Comorach through their reckless behavior fled from her presence, unable to withstand the anathema that Inead represented to their kind. Living Eldari near her experienced something they had never felt before, a sensation of protection, of being shielded from the hunger of she who thirsts by this new power that had manifested in their midst. Yvrain's first act in her new role was to flee Comorach, along with those Drukhari and craftworld Eldari, who recognized in her something worth following. The Visarch, a mysterious warrior whose true name and origins remained unknown, appeared at her side, wielding the ancient Kronesword Asu Yan and declaring himself her champion. Together they led an exodus through collapsing webway tunnels, as Komorrah tore itself apart in the Great Disjunction, the psychic backlash from Inead's partial awakening causing catastrophic damage to the Dark City's infrastructure. They emerged at Craftworld Bieltan, seeking shelter and support, but their arrival coincided with a massive demonic assault. The forces of Slaanesh, alerted to this new threat, represented by Inead's herald, pursued them with murderous intent. Bieltan found itself fighting for survival, its defenders struggling to hold back the demonic tide while protecting their infinity circuit from corruption. As it was during this desperate battle that the Incarnate manifested, the avatar of Inead, a being of death made manifest that appeared wherever Eldari died, channeling their final moments into terrible power turned against the servants of chaos. The Incarnate's intervention helped turn the tide, but the cost was staggering. Bieltan's structure fractured, literally breaking apart under the strain of the energies unleashed during the battle. The Craftworld, that had once been among the most militant and unified of all Asuryani settlements, found itself shattered into pieces, its population divided between those who remained on the fragments of their former home and those who chose to join the Inari and seek salvation through the Seventh Path. This, then, was the movement that Eldrad found himself supporting from his position of exile. Whilst the Inari represented something genuinely new in Eldari society, a faction that transcended traditional divisions between Craftworld Asuryani, Drukhari, Corsairs, and even Harlequins. All were welcome in Inead's embrace. All could find redemption and purpose in service to the god of the dead. It was a unifying force, something that might finally bring the scattered remnants of the Eldari species together toward a common goal. But unity came with its own dangers. The Inari's message was radical, challenging ancient traditions and established power structures across Eldari society. Craftworld seers, who had spent millennia guiding their people according to visions and prophecies dating back to before the fall, now found themselves confronted by young warriors and seers who claimed that those old ways had failed, or that waiting for Inead's natural awakening was simply another form of accepting extinction. The tension between tradition and innovation, between patience and action, threatened to tear apart Craftworld societies already strained by millennia of decline. Yvraine herself was a charismatic leader, her transformation into Inead's herald granting her not just power, but a kind of divine authority that was difficult to argue against. When she spoke, she did so with the weight of a god's blessing, and her words resonated with Eldari, who were tired of waiting, tired of hiding, tired of watching their species slowly fade into oblivion. She promised a future where the Eldari could walk without fear of Slaanesh, where their souls would be truly their own, where they might reclaim at least some measure of the glory that had been lost in the fall. But the seventh path that the Inari proposed was concrete enough to be believable, but ambitious enough to inspire. 5 Kroneswords existed, scattered across the galaxy, each a weapon of tremendous power, forged in the moment of Slaanesh's birth. Legend held that these swords, if brought together and used in a specific ritual, could complete Inead's awakening without requiring the death of the last Eldari. The details of this ritual remained somewhat vague, known primarily to Yvraine through visions granted by Inead itself, but the general concept was clear. Gather the swords, perform the working, awaken the god, destroy Slaanesh, save the species. It was a plan that Eldrad could support, at least in principle. It offered a concrete path forward rather than passive waiting for conditions that might never arrive. It united disparate Eldari factions toward a common purpose, and it addressed the fundamental problem that had plagued his own attempt at Port Demesnes: how to awaken Inead without sacrificing the entire Eldari species in the process. If the seventh path worked, if the Kroneswords truly held the power attributed to them, then his failed ritual might come to be seen not as a disaster, but as a necessary step toward ultimate salvation. But Eldrad's support came with reservations born from 10,000 years of experience. He had seen too many grand plans fail, too many certain paths to victory turn into disasters, to fully embrace the Inari's vision without maintaining some distance and skepticism. His role became that of advisor, an occasional ally, rather than true believer. He provided intelligence about where Cronesords might be found, warned of dangers that lay along the paths Yvraine proposed to take, and used his influence to smooth diplomatic relations between the Inari and Craftworlds that might otherwise have rejected them entirely. The quest for the Cronesords took the Inari across the galaxy and beyond. One sword, Vilith Jar, was already in the possession of the Incarnate itself, claimed during its manifestation. Others required expeditions into places that made even hardened Eldari warriors blanch at the danger. The Crone Worlds, those planets that had once been the heart of the Eldari Empire but now existed within the Eye of Terror itself, held at least some of the remaining swords. Retrieving them would require penetrating deep into Chaos-controlled territory, and facing demons and Chaos Space Marines in their own realm, and escaping alive with artifacts that Slaanesh would fight desperately to prevent them from obtaining. Eldrad accompanied some of these expeditions, his power and experience proving invaluable when the Inari faced threats that would have overwhelmed them otherwise. But he also watched with growing concern as Yvraine's focus on the Cronesords became increasingly all-consuming. She took risks that seemed unjustifiable, sacrificed followers who trusted her, pushed forward into situations where his visions showed disaster waiting. When he counseled caution, she would invoke Inead's will, claiming that the god guided her actions and that doubt served only the enemy. This tension between Eldrad's pragmatic caution and Yvraine's faith-driven determination came to a head during the expedition to Zaisuthra, where the Inari believed they might find another Cronesord. Eldrad had accompanied a Saimhan war host that had allied with the Inari for this venture, lending his foresight to help navigate the dangers they would inevitably face. But his visions of this particular quest were murky, showing futures that branched in confusing and contradictory ways. Something about Zaisuthra interfered with his sight, obscuring outcomes that should have been clear. He counseled that they wait, that they gather more information before committing forces to an expedition whose outcomes he could not clearly perceive. But Yvraine, convinced that time was running short and that the Cronesord was too valuable a prize to leave unclaimed, pressed forward. The expedition was ultimately unsuccessful. They did not find the Cronesord they sought, and the Inari lost warriors in fighting that might have been avoided with better intelligence and preparation. Eldrad's doubts about Yvraine's judgment, already present, deepened into something approaching genuine concern. After Zaisuthra, Eldrad began to drift further from the Inari's inner circle. He still supported them, still provided aid when it was requested, and when his vision suggested it would make a difference, but he no longer committed himself fully to their cause. Yet his foresight showed him futures where Yvraine's increasing desperation led her to make decisions that endangered not just herself, but everyone who followed her, and he had no desire to be caught up in disasters born from faith-driven recklessness. This distancing was noticed by both sides. Some Inari viewed it as betrayal, evidence that Eldrad had never truly believed in Inead's promise and had been using them for his own purposes. Others saw it more charitably, understanding that Eldrad operated according to visions and calculations that were his alone, that his support or lack thereof reflected complex factors that might not be immediately apparent. Yvraine herself seemed to oscillate between frustration at his caution and relief that he remained available to help when crises arose that required his unique capabilities. Yet the search for the Cronesords continued, with varying degrees of success. The Inari grew in numbers and influence, drawing Eldari from across the galaxy who were inspired by their message of hope and action. Yvraine's power as Inead's herald became more refined, her ability to channel the god's essence in combat, making her a formidable force on any battlefield. The Vizarch proved himself again and again as a warrior of exceptional skill, his mastery of Asuyan making him nearly unstoppable in single combat. And the Incarni appeared wherever Eldari died in service to Inead. Its terrible beauty and devastating power, a manifestation of death itself, turned against those who would prey upon the living. But the fundamental problem remained. The Kronzords were proving difficult to locate, and even more difficult to claim. Slanesh guarded those that resided within the Eye of Terror with legions of demons. Other swords had been lost so long that their locations might be permanently beyond recovery, and even if all 5 could be gathered, there was no guarantee that the ritual the Inari believed would complete Inead's awakening would actually work as intended. They were operating on faith and fragmentary visions, a combination that had led many well-intentioned efforts to disaster throughout history. Eldrad watched all of this unfold with the complicated mixture of hope and concern that had come to characterize his emotional response to most things after 10,000 years of bearing impossible burdens. He hoped the Inari would succeed, that the 7th path would prove viable, that Inead would indeed awaken fully and free the Eldari from Slanesh's curse. But he also prepared for the possibility that they would fail, that the quest for the Kronzords would ultimately prove to be another desperate gambit that fell short of its goals, leaving the Eldari no better off than before, and possibly worse, having expended resources and lives on a futile chase. His own visions offered no clear answers. The futures he perceived branching from the Inari's efforts were too numerous and too varied to provide certainty. In some timelines, they succeeded spectacularly, Inead awakening fully and destroying Slanesh in a cosmic battle that shook the foundations of reality itself. In others, they failed catastrophically, with the Kronzords proving to be a trap laid by Slanesh to lure Inead's followers into situations where they could be destroyed en masse. Most futures fell somewhere between these extremes, partial successes or partial failures that changed the Eldari's situation but did not fundamentally resolve their predicament. This uncertainty was perhaps the most frustrating aspect for Eldrad. After 10,000 years of using foresight to guide his actions, to find the paths that led to favorable outcomes, he found himself confronting a situation where the future was genuinely undetermined, where actions in the present would shape outcomes in ways he could influence but not control. It was humbling, this reminder that despite all his power and experience, he remained fundamentally limited in his ability to see and shape what was to come. Yet even in this uncertainty, Eldrad continued his work. He provided what aid he could to the Inari when his visions suggested it would help. He maintained his network of contacts across multiple craft worlds, ensuring that information flowed and that different factions could at least communicate even when they disagreed about strategy. He continued to manipulate events on the broader galactic scale, steering conflicts toward outcomes that weakened chaos and strengthened the Eldari's position. And he continued to search his visions for alternatives, for other paths that might lead to salvation if the 7th path ultimately proved unviable. The relationship between Eldrad and the Inari thus became one of guarded cooperation, each side recognizing the other's value while maintaining reservations about methods and goals. And it was not the wholehearted alliance that some had hoped for, but in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, such perfect alliances were perhaps too much to expect. What mattered was that they could work together when necessary, could coordinate their efforts toward the common goal of Eldari's survival, even if they disagreed about the best methods for achieving that goal. And through it all, the crystallization continued its slow work on Eldrad's physical form, a constant reminder that however long he had already lived, however many crises he had already navigated, time was not infinite even for him. The patches of crystalline transformation spread across his skin, growing larger and more numerous with each passing year. His movements showed increasing stiffness, and his voice carried more of that strange resonance that suggested sound traveling through mineral rather than organic tissue. He was running out of time, and he knew it. Whatever solutions were to be found, Whatever paths to salvation existed, they needed to be discovered and implemented soon, before the crystallization claimed him completely, and the Eldari lost their most experienced and powerful Farseer at a time when they could least afford such a loss. Return to Ulthwi and current status. The galaxy that existed in the wake of the Great Rift's opening was fundamentally different from what had come before. The massive warp storm that split reality from the Eye of Terror to the Hadex anomaly had created what Imperial scholars called the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, a vast region cut off from the light of the Astronomicon and the direct rule of Terror. For the Eldari, this transformation brought both new dangers and unexpected opportunities. The barrier between material and immaterial had weakened throughout the galaxy, making psychic powers easier to wield, but also making demonic incursions more frequent and more devastating. Craftworld Ulthwe, positioned as it had been for millennia near the Eye of Terror, found itself in an even more precarious situation than before. The expansion of warp storms and the general destabilization of reality in the region around the Eye meant that the Craftworld faced attacks with increased frequency and intensity. Where once they might expect a major demonic assault once every few decades, now they faced multiple incursions each year. The Black Guardians, as that standing army that had defended Ulthwi for so long, found themselves in constant deployment, fighting battles that blurred together into an endless war of attrition. It was during one such attack that Eldrad returned to Ulthwe, not as a disgraced exile seeking forgiveness, but as a military commander leading the exiles to the defense of a craftworld under siege. The assault he responded to was massive, multiple chaos warbands, coordinating their attack in ways that suggested intelligent direction rather than the usual opportunistic raiding. Demons poured through tiers in reality that opened across Ulthwi's surface, seeking to reach the Infinity Circuit and corrupt it, to turn the preserved souls of millions of Eldari into fuel for the dark gods. The battle lasted for weeks. It's a grinding fight through Ulthwi's corridors and chambers as defenders contested every centimeter of ground. Eldrad fought alongside warriors who had voted for his exile, coordinated strategies with seers who had condemned his methods, and risked his own existence to save a craftworld that had cast him out. His power proved decisive in several crucial engagements, his mastery of psychic combat allowing him to banish greater demons that would have overwhelmed lesser seers. The Staff of Ulthamar channeled forces that made reality itself scream, and the armor of the last runes turned aside blows that should have ended his long life. When the battle finally ended, when the last demons had been banished and the tiers in reality sealed, Ulthwi had survived, but at tremendous cost. Sections of the craftworld lay in ruins, a structural damage that would take decades to repair, even with the most advanced Eldari techniques. Hundreds of Eldari had died, their souls safely captured in spirit stones, but their living presence lost forever. The Black Guardians had been decimated, entire squads wiped out in fighting that required them to hold positions long past the point where retreat would have been sensible. In the aftermath, Eldrad and the Seer Council met once again in the chamber where his exile had been pronounced. The atmosphere was different now, colored by the shared experience of battle and the understanding that Ulthwi faced threats that dwarfed internal political considerations. The Council acknowledged Eldrad's contribution to the craftworld's defense, recognized that without his intervention, the outcome might have been very different. But they stopped short of lifting his exile, stopped short of restoring him to his former position. The reason, when they finally articulated it, came down to trust and consequences. Eldrad's actions had saved Ulthwi this time, yes, but his previous actions had created situations that continued to harm Eldari interests across the galaxy. The Imperial retaliation for his disruption of the Astronomicon continued. Bieltan remained broken. The crystal seers he had used at Port Damascus were still lost. And most fundamentally, the Seer Council could not trust that Eldrad would not again take actions that he believed necessary without consulting them. Actions that might put the entire craft world at risk in pursuit of goals that were his alone. So a compromise was reached, at an arrangement that satisfied no one completely, but allowed all parties to coexist. Eldrad would be permitted to maintain a presence near Ulthwé to respond to crises, as this one had demonstrated might arise, but he would not be restored to the Seer Council. The exiles who followed him would be welcome to dock at Ulthwé's ports, to resupply and recruit, but they would not be integrated back into the craft world's official military structure. Eldrad could offer counsel when it was sought, but he would not have the authority to command Ulthwé's resources or to commit the craft world to courses of action without the council's approval. It was a half measure that reflected the complex reality of Eldrad's position. He was too valuable to completely exclude, too powerful to ignore, too experienced to dismiss. But he was also too controversial to fully embrace, too willing to take extreme actions, too focused on species survival at any cost. The Seer Council needed his help, but could not fully trust his judgment. Eldrad needed access to Ulthwé's resources and military strength, but could not submit to their oversight. The arrangement they reached acknowledged these contradictions without fully resolving them. The return of Eldrad, even in this limited capacity, exacerbated divisions within Ulthwé that had been growing since the opening of the Great Rift. 3 distinct factions had emerged among the craftworld's population, each with fundamentally different visions for how the Eldari should navigate the new reality they faced. The first and largest faction remained loyal to the Seer Council and the traditional ways. These Eldari believed that the methods that had sustained their species for 10,000 years since the fall would continue to serve them well. They trusted in the visions of their seers, in the ancient paths that guided Eldari society, in the slow but careful approach that prioritized preservation over risky gambits. They looked at the chaos unleashed by Eldrad's actions and the disruption caused by the Inari's rise and saw validation of their conservative approach. Better to move slowly and survive than to grasp for rapid solutions and risk everything. The second faction comprised the exiles and their sympathizers, Eldari, who believed that traditional methods had failed and that more aggressive action was necessary. They looked at the galaxy around them and saw that the status quo meant slow extinction, that waiting for conditions to improve simply gave enemies more time to plot the Eldari's destruction. They admired Eldrad's willingness to take risks, to sacrifice whatever was necessary in pursuit of species survival. They believed the Port Dominus ritual, despite its failure to achieve complete success, had nevertheless resulted in Iniad's partial awakening, which was more than conservative approaches had achieved in millennia. The third faction had fully embraced the Inari cause, joining Ivrain's followers and dedicating themselves to Iniad's service. These Eldari had either left Ulthwé entirely or maintained only nominal connection to the craft world, their true loyalty given to the god of the dead rather than to any particular craft world or seer council. They were the most radical, and believing that the seventh path represented the only genuine hope for salvation, and that all other approaches were simply variations on accepting extinction. These 3 factions coexisted in uneasy equilibrium, sometimes cooperating when threats to Ulthwé demanded unity, more often pursuing separate goals according to their own visions of the future. The Seer Council worked to maintain diplomatic relations with other craft worlds, and to defend Ulthwé's territory through careful application of foresight and military force. The exiles ranged across the galaxy, supporting Inari operations while also pursuing objectives that Eldrad's visions suggested would benefit the Eldari cause. The Inari faithful sought Kronzords and fought to expand Iniad's influence among Eldari populations wherever they could find receptive audiences. Eldrad himself moved between these factions as circumstances required, offering counsel to the Seer Council when they sought it, leading the exiles in operations he deemed necessary, and providing occasional assistance to the Inari when his visions suggested their success would advance Eldari interests. He became, in effect, a free agent, beholden to no single faction but engaged with all of them, his ultimate loyalty given not to any organization or leader, but to the abstract concept of Eldari survival itself. His current status is thus difficult to categorize. He is not High Farseer of Ulthwé, having been stripped of that title during his exile, but he remains the most powerful and experienced Farseer alive, and his visions carry weight that other seers cannot match. He is not a leader of the Inari, having maintained his distance from full commitment to their cause, but he provides crucial support to their operations, and his approval or disapproval influences how other Eldari factions view their movement. He is not officially part of Ulthwé's power structure, but his presence looms over the Craftworld's politics and military operations in ways that make his influence impossible to ignore. The crystallization continues its advance, now visible enough that any Eldari who interacts with Eldrad can see the patches of psychic crystals spreading across his skin. His movements have slowed, the stiffness of crystallizing joints making even simple gestures require conscious effort. His voice carries an increasingly pronounced crystalline resonance, with words echoing through transformed tissue in ways that make him sound less like a living Eldari and more like some hybrid creature suspended between flesh and mineral, between life and the strange existence of crystal seers frozen in their final visions. Yet his mind remains sharp, his visions undimmed by the physical transformation claiming his body. He continues to peer into futures that stretch decades and centuries ahead, to manipulate events with the same skill that has characterized his entire impossibly long life. If anything, the knowledge that his time is finally running out has made him more focused, more determined to accomplish goals that have eluded him thus far. There is an urgency to his recent actions that was not present before, and a sense that he is racing against time to implement solutions before crystallization renders him unable to continue his work. His relationship with the broader Eldari community has become something scholars might study for centuries to come, a case study in how a single individual can be simultaneously revered and reviled, necessary and problematic, trusted and distrusted. Younger Eldari who have grown up hearing stories about Eldrad Ulthran often struggle to reconcile the contradictions in those tales. Is he the hero who has saved the species countless times through his visions and manipulations? Or is he the arrogant schemer whose actions have cost Eldari lives and alienated potential allies? The answer, frustratingly for those seeking clarity, is that he is both, that his legacy is too complex to reduce to simple judgments of good or bad, right or wrong. Some Craftworld seers have begun to quietly study Eldrad's methods, trying to understand how he has delayed crystallization for so long, how he has managed to maintain his power and clarity of vision, when other Farseers who have lived far shorter spans have succumbed to the transformation. This research is conducted discreetly, because officially, the techniques Eldrad uses might involve knowledge or practices that the seer councils would not approve. But unofficially, everyone understands that the Eldari cannot afford to lose whatever wisdom Eldrad has accumulated, that when he finally crystallizes completely, the species will lose something irreplaceable. There are also efforts underway to document his knowledge, as to extract and preserve information about the countless events he has witnessed, the manipulations he has orchestrated, the visions he has perceived across his 10,000-year existence. These efforts meet with mixed success because Eldrad has never been particularly forthcoming about his methods or his long-term plans. He shares what he believes others need to know and keeps the rest to himself, operating according to a strategic vision that he has never fully explained to anyone. The current status of Eldrad Ulthran is thus that of a being in transition, moving toward an endpoint he cannot prevent, but can still delay, working to accomplish goals he has pursued for millennia while time runs out. He is the last of a generation, perhaps the last Farseer who remembers the Eldari as they were in the immediate aftermath of the fall, who has directly witnessed the entire span of human history, from the unification of Terra through the Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy, and all the long millennia of the Imperium's slow decay. When he finally crystallizes completely, when the transformation that has been claiming him for thousands of years finally runs its course, the Eldari will lose not just their most powerful seer, but their living link to their own history. And in the meantime, in the years or decades, or possibly centuries that remain to him, Eldrad continues his work, manipulating the threads of fate with hands that are slowly turning to crystal, seeing futures with eyes that glitter with internal luminescence, speaking prophecies with a voice that resonates through both flesh and mineral. He stands at the intersection of past and future, tradition and innovation, a hope and despair, a living monument to Eldari determination to survive against odds that seem insurmountable. And the galaxy, for all its indifference to the struggles of any particular species, will be a very different place when Eldrad Ulthran is finally gone. Legacy and impact on the galaxy. To measure the full impact of Eldrad Ulthran on galactic history would require access to information that even he, with all his foresight, does not possess. The ripple effects of his manipulations extend across millennia and touch the fates of countless species, civilizations, and individuals who never knew they were being influenced by an alien seer working toward goals they could not comprehend. But even looking at just the documented cases, the events where his involvement is known or strongly suspected, the scope of his influence is staggering. Let's consider the Imperium of Man, that vast and decaying empire that spans 1,000,000 worlds and countless trillions of human lives. Eldrad's fingerprints can be found throughout its history, from the warning he attempted to deliver during the Horus Heresy, to the redirecting of Gazkul's green tide toward Armageddon, to countless smaller interventions that prevented disasters, or, just as often, caused them. The Imperium does not know how much of its history has been shaped by this single Eldari's machinations, and perhaps that ignorance is a mercy, because the truth would be profoundly disturbing to a species that prides itself on being the dominant power in the galaxy. The Second War for Armageddon, orchestrated by Eldrad to save 10,000 Eldari lives, cost the Imperium millions of human casualties, and entire regiments were destroyed in fighting that, from a human perspective, seemed to arise from bad luck and orcish unpredictability. The planetary government was forced to mobilize its entire population for war, transforming a productive industrial world into a desperate fortress fighting for survival. The war left scars, physical and psychological, that persist to this day in imperial records and in the memories of those who fought. Yet from a broader strategic perspective, one could argue that Eldrad did humanity a favor. Gazgakul's horde, had it been allowed to strike at the targets its natural inclinations suggested, would have caused far more damage across a wider area. By concentrating that threat at Armageddon, where the Imperium could bring its full military might to bear, and Eldrad arguably minimized the total damage the orcs could inflict. This is not how the Imperium sees it, of course. They only know that an alien manipulation cost them millions of lives in a war they need not have fought. The fact that the alternative might have been worse provides cold comfort to the widows and orphans left behind. The Sanapan Scouring, the Mortis Annihilation, the Third Coming of Orion, each of these represents imperial military campaigns that Eldrad influenced or directly orchestrated to serve Eldari interests. In each case, human commanders believed they were making decisions based on their own intelligence and strategic assessments, never realizing that the information they received had been carefully curated, that the threats they faced had been deliberately positioned to draw their attention in specific directions. The Imperium fought wars that needed to be fought, from Eldrad's perspective, wars that removed chaos threats or orcish populations that would otherwise have eventually threatened Eldari holdings. The warning to Iyanden about Hive Fleet Kraken represents a different kind of impact, though no less significant. Without Eldrad's intervention, Iyanden would have been completely destroyed, its millions of souls consumed by tyrannid hunger, or, if they managed to escape their bodies before being eaten, drawn inevitably to Slaanesh. the loss would have diminished the entire Eldari species in ways that could never be recovered. Instead, Ayandan survived, albeit as a ghostcraft world where wraith constructs outnumber the living. And its continued existence, its accumulated knowledge and culture, represents a victory against extinction that Eldrad can claim as directly resulting from his foresight and willingness to act on it. But Eldrad's influence extends beyond just military conflicts and strategic manipulations. His role in developing the modern form of the Path of the Seer means that every Farseer who has come after him uses techniques and methods that bear his influence. The psychic runes cast to divine the future, the meditation practices used to open oneself to visions, the protective disciplines that guard against warp corruption, all of these show his fingerprints. In a very real sense, Eldrad helped create the framework through which all contemporary Eldari seers perceive and interact with the future. His relationship with the Phoenix Lords, those immortal champions who predate the fall and carry the accumulated skill and knowledge of all who have worn their aspect armor, provides another dimension to his legacy. Asamen, Jane Zar, and others have worked alongside Eldrad on various occasions, and their respect for his abilities is documented in sources considered reliable. The Phoenix Lords are not known for giving praise lightly, so their acknowledgement of Eldrad's power and importance carries significant weight. The attempted awakening of Iniad at Port Demesnes, despite its failure to achieve full success, nevertheless catalyzed changes in Eldari society that continue to reverberate. The Inari movement, the birth of Ivrain as Iniad's herald, the manifestation of the Incarni, all of these flow directly from Eldrad's decision to attempt that ritual. Whether these developments will ultimately prove beneficial or catastrophic remains to be seen, but they undeniably represent the most significant shift in Eldari religious and social organization since the fall itself. For good or ill, Eldrad has fundamentally altered the trajectory of his species. His role in the Horus heresy, particularly his opposition to the Cabal and his work to ensure humanity's survival as a bulwark against chaos, demonstrates strategic thinking on a scale that extends across millennia. The Cabal's plan to allow Horus to win and humanity to be destroyed might have succeeded without Eldrad's interference. Whether that would have actually led to Chaos's ultimate defeat, as the Cabal believed, or simply to a galaxy where chaos ran rampant across previously human worlds, is something no one can know for certain. As what is certain is that Eldrad saw humanity as worth preserving and acted to ensure they survived, even though doing so required him to directly oppose other alien species and organizations who had different visions of how to deal with the chaos threat. The various maiden worlds that continue to exist as pristine natural paradises, hosting exodite communities who live in harmony with their environment, owe their survival in part to Eldrad's manipulations. On numerous occasions, he has diverted potential threats away from these worlds, sometimes through military action, but more often through the kind of subtle maneuvering that makes enemies focus their attention elsewhere. The Exodites themselves may not know how often Eldrad has intervened on their behalf, but the fact that they continue to exist at all in a galaxy filled with species eager to claim habitable worlds for themselves speaks to the effectiveness of his protective efforts. His influence on other craft worlds extends beyond just strategic interventions during crises. Eldrad's visions and counsel have been sought by seers from dozens of different craft worlds over the millennia. His reputation as the most powerful and accurate Farseer alive means that when he offers warnings or suggestions, even craft worlds that distrust Ulthui's methods often take his words seriously. This gives him a kind of informal authority across Eldari society that transcends any official position he might hold or have held. As the relationship Eldrad helped establish between Craftworld Ulthwé and Navigator House Belisarius represents another example of his long-term strategic planning. This secret alliance, forged in the 31st millennium and maintained for 10,000 years through a system of 7 coins that can be used to call in debts, has provided the Eldari with intelligence and influence within the Imperium that would otherwise be impossible to obtain. The arrangement requires that House Belisarius keep their end of the bargain secret from the space wolves they primarily navigate for, a deception that has somehow been maintained across millennia, suggesting that the benefits both sides receive must be substantial indeed. His various encounters with Abaddon the Despoiler, particularly their duel on Andante 4, and have earned Eldrad a reputation among the servants of chaos as a being to be treated with extreme caution. The fact that he nearly killed Abaddon in personal combat, cleaving through Terminator armor that had turned aside countless attacks from lesser warriors, demonstrated that Eldrad was not just a psyker to be avoided, but a physical combatant capable of holding his own against some of the galaxy's most formidable champions. This reputation has likely prevented numerous chaos attacks on Ulthwi and other Eldari holdings, as would-be raiders recognize that Eldrad's presence makes any assault far more dangerous than it would otherwise be. The influence he has exerted over human history, often without humans being aware of it, creates interesting philosophical questions about agency and manipulation. How many Imperial commanders have made decisions that seem to be their own, but were actually responding to situations that Eldrad carefully constructed? How many wars were fought because he arranged for intelligence to reach the right people at the right time? How many disasters were prevented by manipulations so subtle that no one realized they had been saved? The answers to these questions are unknowable, but the fact that they can even be asked speaks to the scope of Eldrad's operations. Among the Harlequins, Eldrad is a figure of particular interest. The servants of Kegarak appreciate subtlety and misdirection, the art of achieving goals through indirect means rather than direct confrontation. Eldrad's methods align with this philosophy in ways that make him something of a kindred spirit to the Harlequins, though he has never formally joined their ranks. The cooperation between Eldrad and various Harlequin troops, particularly the Mask of the Midnight Sorrow, demonstrates a mutual respect and understanding that transcends the usual boundaries between different Eldari factions. His impact on chaos, while less obvious than his impact on the Imperium or his own species, should not be underestimated. Every time Eldrad has successfully opposed a chaos plot, prevented a demonic incursion, or eliminated a servant of the dark gods, he has struck a blow against entities that exist partially outside normal time and causality. The fact that they remember him, that demons and chaos champions speak his name with anger and frustration, suggests that he has been a genuine thorn in their side for millennia. In the cosmic struggle against the ruinous powers, Eldrad represents one of the most effective single opponents chaos has faced, a being whose foresight allows him to counter their plots before they fully develop. The question of what the galaxy will look like after Eldrad finally crystallizes completely is one that troubles many who understand his importance. Will the Eldari find another seer capable of filling the void his absence will create? Will the Inari's seventh path succeed in time to awaken Iniad fully before that happens? Will the careful balance Eldrad has maintained between various factions and forces collapse without his guiding hand? These questions have no clear answers, because the futures that branch from Eldrad's eventual crystallization are among the murkiest and most difficult to perceive, even for seers of considerable power. What seems certain is that Eldrad Ulthran's legacy will be debated and analyzed for as long as the Eldari species continues to exist. He will be remembered as their most powerful seer, their most controversial leader, the individual who saved them countless times, and whose methods sometimes horrified even those who benefited from them. His name will be spoken with reverence and anger, with gratitude and condemnation, by beings who cannot agree on whether he was their savior or the architect of their continued suffering. And perhaps that ambiguity, that inability to reduce him to simple categories of good or bad, hero or villain, is the most fitting legacy for a being who has always operated in shades of grey, who has always understood that in a galaxy as dark as this one, where survival often requires doing terrible things in service of necessary goals. Conclusion. The weight of foresight. As our journey through the life and legacy of Eldrad Ulthran comes to a close, we find ourselves confronted with a being who defies easy understanding, who challenges our assumptions about what it means to be a leader, a visionary, or even simply a living creature struggling to survive in an impossibly hostile universe. For more than 10,000 years, Eldrad has stood watch over his species, peering into futures that most beings could not comprehend, making choices that would break lesser minds, bearing burdens that grow heavier with each passing century. To understand Eldrad is to understand the fundamental tragedy of the Eldari species. They were once masters of the galaxy, yes, beings of such power and sophistication that they could reshape reality with thought alone. But their fall, the catastrophic birth of Slaanesh, from their own collective excess and depravity, reduced them to scattered refugees clinging to survival aboard craftworlds and in hidden enclaves across the stars. Every Eldari who has lived since the fall carries the weight of that ancient crime, knows that when they die, their soul faces eternal torment unless it can be preserved in a spirit stone. This knowledge colors everything about their society, their culture, their very way of thinking about existence itself. Into this context was born, or perhaps transformed, Eldrad Ulthran, a being whose psychic gifts marked him as exceptional even among a species of natural psychers. And his ability to see further and more clearly into the future than any other Farseer gave him power, yes, but it also gave him responsibility. When you can perceive disasters before they occur, when you can see paths that might lead to salvation and paths that lead only to extinction, the weight of that knowledge becomes crushing. Every choice becomes fraught with consequences that ripple across decades or centuries. Every action or inaction shapes futures in ways that affect millions or billions of lives. The crystallization that slowly claims all Farseers takes on special significance when we consider Eldrad's case. For most seers, the transformation arrives after a few centuries, a natural endpoint to a life spent channeling psychic energies that mortal flesh was never meant to contain. But Eldrad has delayed this fate for millennia, as through methods that remain his secret, driven by an understanding that his people need him in ways they do not need other seers. He has made himself irreplaceable, and in doing so, he has sentenced himself to continue bearing impossible burdens long past the point where most beings would have welcomed the peace that crystallization offers. The patches of crystal spreading across his skin are not just markers of his mortality. They are visual representations of the price he has paid for his service, the gradual conversion of living flesh into something harder, colder, more enduring, but less alive. Each glittering formation represents years of peering into futures that should not be seen, years of channeling powers that strain the boundaries of what physical form can endure, years of carrying the weight of decisions that haunt him in whatever passes for dreams among beings who exist partially in the warp, even while their bodies remain in real space. When we judge Eldrad's actions, and judge them, we must, if we are to understand him, rather than simply recount his deeds, we must remember the context in which he operates. The Eldari are a dying species, diminishing with each generation, facing extinction at the hands of a god they themselves created. Every death feeds Slaanesh. Every soul, not preserved in a spirit stone, adds to the power of the entity hunting them. In such circumstances, the calculations that guide normal moral reasoning break down. When your species faces extinction, when every alternative leads to doom, except for paths that require terrible sacrifices, what is acceptable? What is forgivable? Eldrad has answered these questions by deciding that anything that preserves the Eldari is justified, that any cost paid by other species, or even by other Eldari, is acceptable if it purchases continued survival for his people as a whole. This is not a comfortable philosophy. It leads to the Second War for Armageddon, where millions of humans died to save thousands of Eldari. It leads to Port Demesnes, where crystal seers were used as tools without their consent, and where the ritual's failure endangered every craftworld in the galaxy. It leads to countless smaller manipulations, each one defensible in isolation, but collectively creating a pattern of behavior that makes even other Eldari uncomfortable. Yet what alternative did he have? To do nothing, to simply watch as his species slowly faded into extinction, was not acceptable to him. And the traditional approach of the seer councils, careful and conservative, might have seemed wise, but Eldrad's visions showed him that it led ultimately to the same destination, extinction, just arriving more slowly. If all paths led to doom, then at least taking action, however risky, offered the possibility that something might change, that some unexpected outcome might emerge from the chaos he created. The relationship between Eldrad and the Inari movement crystallizes many of the tensions that have defined his long existence. He supports them because they represent hope, because the seventh path offers a concrete plan for achieving something that has seemed impossible for 10 millennia. The defeat of Slaanesh and the liberation of Eldari souls from eternal torment. But he cannot fully commit to their cause because his visions show him futures where faith-driven certainty leads to catastrophe, where Ivrain's desperation drives her to make mistakes that cost lives and opportunities. So he maintains distance, supports without fully joining, aids without committing. It is a characteristic Eldrad position, maintaining flexibility to adapt as circumstances change, refusing to put all his hopes into a single basket, lest that basket prove to have holes. This pragmatism has served him well across millennia, but it also prevents him from experiencing the kind of community and shared purpose that makes life meaningful for most beings. He is always somewhat apart, always calculating, always seeing not just what is, but what might be. And that perspective makes genuine connection with others nearly impossible. But the crystallization advancing through his body serves as a timer counting down to an ending he can delay, but not prevent. Somewhere in the years or decades ahead, the transformation will complete, and Eldrad Ulthran, as a mobile, active force in galactic affairs, will cease to exist. His consciousness might persist within the crystal form, might continue to offer visions and counsel to seers who commune with him through psychic connection, but it will not be the same. The galaxy will lose its most powerful and experienced Farseer at a time when it can least afford such a loss. What will happen to the Eldari without Eldrad? The question haunts not just him, but every seer who understands his importance. The Inari offer one possible path forward, though their success remains uncertain. Traditional craftworld methods offer another, though they have failed to reverse the species' decline for 10,000 years. The exiles that follow Eldrad offer a third path, more aggressive and willing to take risks, but without Eldrad's unique foresight to guide them, they might simply create disasters without the compensating benefits his visions usually ensure. Perhaps the answer is that the Eldari will find a way to survive without him, that his greatest contribution will prove to be not any specific action, but rather the example he set of refusing to accept extinction passively. He has shown that a single individual, even one from a dying species facing impossible odds, can shape the fates of civilizations through will and foresight, and the courage to take actions that others consider too extreme. Or whether the Eldari who come after him can match his determination remains to be seen, but at least he has demonstrated that such determination is possible. As we conclude this exploration of Eldrad Ulthran's life and legacy, we are left with a figure who embodies both the heights of what the Eldari can achieve and the depths to which they have fallen. He is a master manipulator who has orchestrated events across millennia, yet he is also a refugee from a fallen civilization struggling desperately to prevent his species' final extinction. He is a being of tremendous power who has broken titans and banished greater demons, yet he is also slowly dying, crystallizing by degrees into a living statue that will eventually freeze in the moment of its final vision. The weight of foresight. Yet the burden of seeing futures that have not yet occurred and may never occur has defined Eldrad's existence for longer than most civilizations endure. He has borne this burden without respite, without the comfort of ignorance that allows most beings to focus on the present, without being overwhelmed by knowledge of all the terrible things that might happen. Every moment of his impossibly long life has been shadowed by visions of disaster, and every choice he has made has been an attempt to navigate between futures that offer only different varieties of doom. Yet through it all, through 10,000 years of manipulation and sacrifice and compromise and loss, Eldrad Ulthran has never surrendered. He has never accepted extinction as inevitable. He has never stopped fighting. He never stopped searching for the path that might lead his people to salvation. And in a galaxy where hope is a rare and precious commodity, where the darkness presses in from all sides, and where even the mightiest civilizations are slowly ground to dust beneath the weight of entropy and endless war, that refusal to surrender might be his greatest achievement. When the crystallization finally claims him, when Eldrad Ulthran becomes a frozen monument to Eldari determination rather than a living force shaping galactic events, the universe will remember him in different ways. The Imperium of Man will remember him as a Xenos threat, an alien manipulator whose schemes cost human lives. The forces of chaos will remember him as an opponent who thwarted their plans for millennia. Other Eldari will remember him as their savior, their tormentor, their greatest seer, their most controversial leader, a being too complex to be reduced to simple judgments of good or evil. But perhaps the most fitting memorial for Eldrad Ulthran is simply this. He was the oldest living Eldari in Warhammer 40k, a being who had witnessed the entire span of human history from the shadows, who had shaped events across a scale that few could comprehend, who had carried the weight of his species' survival on his shoulders for longer than most species exist. And when his time finally comes, when the crystal claims the last of his flesh, and his consciousness freezes in that final moment, the galaxy will be a different place for his absence. Whether it will be better or worse, only time will tell. But it will certainly be different because Eldrad Ulthran, for all his flaws and all his crimes, left a mark on reality that will take millennia to fade. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of the oldest living Eldar in Warhammer 40k. If you found this exploration of Eldrad Ulthran's story compelling, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the lore of Warhammer 40,000. The grim darkness of the far future holds countless stories worth telling, and I look forward to sharing more of them with you in videos to come. Until next time, may your visions be clear and your path be true. Eldrad's philosophy and methods. A deeper analysis. To truly comprehend the enigma that is Eldrad, Ulthran requires examining not just what he has done across his 10 millennia of existence, but how he thinks, the philosophical framework that underlies his seemingly contradictory actions, the methodology he employs to translate visions of possible futures into concrete interventions in the present. This deeper analysis reveals layers of complexity that are often overlooked in simple recountings of his achievements and failures, complexities that help explain why he remains such a controversial figure even among those who benefit most directly from his protection. At the core of Eldrad's philosophy lies a concept that might be called consequentialist absolutism. He judges actions entirely by their outcomes, with no weight given to the morality of the methods used to achieve those outcomes. This is not moral relativism, precisely, because Eldrad does have an absolute value that guides all his choices, the survival and eventual restoration of the Eldari species. Everything else, including individual lives, the established customs, political alliances, and even his own comfort and reputation, is negotiable in service of that ultimate goal. This creates a moral framework that can justify almost any action, as long as it can be shown to advance Eldari interests, a flexibility that makes him simultaneously more effective and more ethically troubling than seers who operate within more conventional moral constraints. The development of this philosophy can be traced to the trauma of witnessing the fall itself, or at least its immediate aftermath. Eldrad is old enough to remember when the Eldari were not refugees clinging to survival, but a civilization at the height of its power, when entire worlds bent to their will, and the concept of extinction seemed impossibly remote. the catastrophic destruction of that civilization, at the birth of a god from their own collective excesses, the eternal curse that now marks every Eldari soul for damnation, all of this impressed upon young Eldrad a lesson that has guided him ever since. No price is too high to pay to prevent such catastrophe from happening again. Where other Eldari might have drawn different conclusions from the fall, perhaps focusing on the importance of humility, or the dangers of hubris, or the need to maintain moral purity, Eldrad extracted what he considered the only lesson that mattered. Survival requires absolute commitment and the willingness to do whatever is necessary. The Eldari had been powerful, but had failed to save themselves because they could not, or would not, take the harsh actions needed to prevent their society's descent into the excess that birthed Slaanesh. In Eldrad's interpretation, their failure was not one of being too ruthless, but of not being ruthless enough, of allowing sentiment and tradition and conventional morality to blind them to the precipice they approached. This interpretation is, of course, controversial and probably incomplete. Many other Eldari scholars would argue that the fall occurred precisely because their ancestors became too focused on sensation and experience at the expense of other values, that more ruthlessness would not have saved them, but only hastened their doom. But Eldrad's visions have validated his approach often enough that he has never been persuaded to reconsider his fundamental assumptions. When his calculations lead to outcomes that save craft worlds or prevent disasters, this reinforces his belief that consequentialism justifies his methods. When they lead to outcomes that others consider failures or moral catastrophes, he interprets these as acceptable costs, paid for benefits that critics cannot perceive because they lack his clarity of vision. The methodology Eldrad employs to translate his visions into effective action deserves particular attention because it represents perhaps his most distinctive contribution to the art of farseer practice. Where many seers focus primarily on prediction, on simply perceiving what is likely to happen and warning others about it, Eldrad has developed sophisticated techniques for manipulation, for actively shaping which possible futures become reality, rather than merely forecasting what will occur if current trends continue. Central to these techniques is what might be called causal chain analysis. When Eldrad identifies a desirable future state, he works backward through causality to determine what conditions would need to exist for that future to manifest. Then he works backward again to identify what actions in the present or near future would create those necessary conditions. This process can extend across multiple layers of causality, with Eldrad sometimes orchestrating events that will not bear fruit for decades or centuries, setting up conditions that will eventually lead to outcomes he considers beneficial. The Second War for Armageddon provides an excellent case study in this methodology. Eldrad's ultimate goal was to protect Craftworld space from Orcish invasion. The necessary condition for achieving this was directing existing Orcish aggression toward a target that could absorb it without threatening Eldari interests. This required creating an Orcish warlord powerful enough to unite the scattered green tide, but simultaneously ensuring that warlord would choose a specific target rather than following natural Orcish inclinations. So Eldrad worked backward through the causal chain. To create the warlord, he needed to provide challenges that would allow a particularly cunning orc to rise to prominence. To ensure the right target was chosen, he needed to make Armageddon seem more attractive than alternatives, while simultaneously making Craftworld space seem less attractive or less accessible. Each step in this chain required its own interventions, most of them subtle enough that none of the actors involved realized they were being manipulated. Eldari rangers conducted raids calculated to push specific orc clans toward conflict with each other, while leaving survivors who would remember tales of the aliens' strength, making future raids against Craftworld holdings seem less appealing. Intelligence was carefully leaked to Imperial sources to ensure Armageddon's defenses appeared weaker than they were, making the world seem like an easier target than it actually turned out to be. Trade routes were disrupted in ways that made alternative targets less accessible to Orcish forces at crucial moments in their migration patterns. All of this occurred across decades, with Eldrad monitoring the developing situation through his visions and making adjustments as circumstances changed. The final result, the Second War for Armageddon, untold, seemed like a natural confluence of orcish aggression and imperial vulnerability, with no visible Eldari fingerprints to suggest manipulation. Only Eldrad and a few trusted advisors knew the truth, that what appeared to be random events were actually carefully choreographed to produce a specific outcome. This level of manipulation requires not just powerful visions, but tremendous patience and a willingness to accept that many individual steps in the process may not work out as planned. Eldrad has developed what might be called probabilistic redundancy in his schemes, creating multiple parallel paths toward his goals so that if one approach fails, others can compensate. When he worked to redirect Gazkul's forces, he did not rely on a single manipulation, but created numerous different pressures, all pushing in the same general direction, so that even if several of these pressures failed to produce their intended effects, the cumulative weight of the successful ones would still achieve the overall objective. This redundancy also provides protection against detection. If a scheme relies on a single crucial manipulation, discovery and prevention of that manipulation dooms the entire effort. But if a scheme involves dozens or hundreds of small manipulations, each individually insufficient but collectively powerful, then even if some are detected and countered, the plan can still succeed. This makes Eldrad's work extremely difficult to oppose effectively, because would-be opponents cannot simply identify and neutralize a single linchpin, but must instead try to counter numerous distributed interventions, many of which may not even be recognized as related to the same overarching strategy. The information management aspect of Eldrad's methodology deserves particular examination because it reveals another dimension of his sophistication. He operates on the principle that what people believe to be true often matters more than what is actually true, because actions are based on perceptions rather than objective reality. This means that shaping perceptions, controlling information flows, and managing narratives can be as effective as directly intervening in physical events, often at much lower cost and risk. When Eldrad wants a human commander to make a particular decision, he rarely approaches that commander directly with advice. Instead, he ensures that the intelligence reports reaching that commander contain information that will naturally lead to the desired conclusion. This intelligence might be entirely accurate, might be carefully curated truth rather than outright fabrication, which makes it harder to dismiss as enemy disinformation. The commander believes they are making a decision based on their own analysis of reliable information, never suspecting that both the information and their analysis of it have been shaped by an alien seer working toward goals they cannot perceive. This approach extends to managing narratives about Eldrad himself and about Eldari intentions more broadly. Of the Imperium's perception of Eldrad as a treacherous Xenos manipulator, while not entirely inaccurate, serves his purposes in many ways. It means that when Eldari forces appear to aid human forces, the Imperium's suspicion and distrust prevent them from expecting such aid or trying to coordinate with it more extensively. This reduces the risk of humans discovering the full extent of Eldari manipulation and makes it easier for Eldrad to withdraw support or even switch to opposition when circumstances change without humans feeling particularly betrayed, since they never fully trusted the Eldari anyway. Similarly, Eldrad's controversial status among other Eldari, while personally uncomfortable, provides him with a kind of political freedom. Because he has already been exiled, because his reputation is already damaged, while he can take actions that other Farseers could not without facing social costs he has already paid. This makes him more effective as a leader, precisely because he is not constrained by the need to maintain political support within conventional power structures. He operates as a free agent, beholden to his own vision of what the Eldari need, rather than to the consensus of any Seer Council or the preferences of any Craftworld's population. The temporal dimension of Eldrad's operations reveals yet another layer of sophistication. where most beings operate within time horizons, measured in years or decades at most, Eldrad routinely works with plans that will not come to fruition for centuries. This capability derives from both his longevity, which ensures he will likely still be around when long-term plans mature, and his foresight, which allows him to perceive the long-term consequences of current actions with unusual clarity. But it also requires a kind of disciplined patience that most beings simply cannot maintain, the ability to work steadily toward goals that may not be achieved within the lifetimes of anyone currently alive except himself. This temporal scope creates both advantages and vulnerabilities. The advantage is that Eldrad can pursue strategies that would never occur to beings with shorter time horizons, can set in motion causal chains so long and complex that no one else would attempt them. The vulnerability is that very long-term plans require many more assumptions about the future, each of which represents a potential point of failure. If conditions change significantly, if new actors enter the stage, if unpredictable events disrupt carefully laid plans, all the work invested in a century-long manipulation might come to nothing. Eldrad's visions help mitigate this vulnerability by allowing him to perceive potential disruptions before they occur. But even his foresight has limits, as the Deathwatcher's intervention at Port Demesnes demonstrated. The scale and complexity of Eldrad's operations create challenges in coordination and control that would be insurmountable for most commanders. He cannot personally oversee every aspect of plans that span continents or star systems, that involve hundreds of actors, each making crucial decisions at different times. This necessitates a network of agents and allies who can be trusted to act appropriately without necessarily understanding the full scope of what they are contributing to. Eldrad has developed sophisticated methods for managing such networks, for ensuring that each participant has exactly the information they need to play their role without revealing the larger pattern that would make the manipulation obvious. This compartmentalization serves multiple purposes. It provides security against exposure, as agents who do not understand the full plan cannot betray it even under interrogation or torture. It allows Eldrad to work with beings whose cooperation might not be forthcoming if they understood his ultimate goals. And it creates plausible deniability, allowing Eldrad to disavow responsibility for actions taken by agents who were following his guidance without explicit direction. The cost is that compartmentalization sometimes leads to inefficiencies, and as agents working toward the same ultimate goal may interfere with each other because they do not recognize their common purpose. But Eldrad considers this an acceptable trade-off for the security and flexibility compartmentalization provides. The moral and psychological toll of operating according to Eldrad's philosophy and methods is substantial, and helps explain why so few Farseers attempt to emulate his approach even among those who admire his effectiveness. The constant calculation of acceptable losses, the need to treat other beings as pieces to be moved on a game board, rather than individuals with intrinsic worth, the requirement to maintain emotional distance even from members of one's own species. All of this exacts a price, measured not in years of life, but in pieces of soul, gradually worn away by the necessities of the role. Eldrad's apparent emotional coldness, his difficulty connecting with others on a personal level, his treatment of individuals as abstractions, whose value derives entirely from their role in larger patterns. These are not just personality quirks, but necessary adaptations to the kind of work he does. To feel deep personal connection to beings you may need to sacrifice for strategic purposes would be psychologically devastating. To mourn each individual loss when your plans routinely result in deaths numbering thousands or millions would make it impossible to function. The distance that others criticize as callousness is actually a defense mechanism, a way of maintaining the capacity to act in situations where empathy would be paralyzing. But this defense mechanism comes with costs of its own. The very detachment that allows Eldrad to function effectively in his role also cuts him off from sources of meaning and purpose that sustain most beings across long lifespans. Personal relationships, community bonds, simple pleasures and joys, all of these become difficult or impossible to maintain when you operate according to consequentialist calculus that values everything only insofar as it contributes to species survival. Eldrad has sacrificed not just comfort and reputation, but his own capacity for the kind of life that most Eldari would consider worth living. And while he would argue this sacrifice is necessary and worthwhile, it is nonetheless a genuine loss that should be acknowledged rather than simply dismissed as the price of leadership. The question of whether Eldrad's philosophy and methods represent the only viable approach to ensuring Eldari survival, or whether they are simply one option among several, remains hotly debated among those who understand what he does and why he does it. Critics argue that the costs of his approach, both moral and practical, outweigh the benefits, that his methods create as many problems as they solve, that a less manipulative approach might achieve similar outcomes with fewer negative consequences. Supporters counter that critics have the luxury of questioning his methods precisely because Eldrad's efforts have prevented disasters that would have eliminated any opportunity for debate, or that those who advocate for alternative approaches typically have not thought through the implications of those alternatives with the rigor that Eldrad brings to his work. What seems clear is that whether or not Eldrad's approach is optimal, it has demonstrably worked often enough to justify continued employment of his methods from his own perspective. The Eldari species continues to exist despite facing threats that have destroyed other civilizations, and while many factors contribute to that survival, Eldrad's interventions have undeniably played a significant role. Whether someone else following different methods could have achieved equally good outcomes is ultimately unknowable, a counterfactual that can never be tested because history follows only one path among many possible alternatives. As we continue examining Eldrad's story, as we explore the specific events and crises that have defined his long existence, keeping this deeper understanding of his philosophy and methods in mind will help make sense of actions that might otherwise seem arbitrary or contradictory. Every choice he makes, however strange it might appear to outsiders, flows from this fundamental framework: consequentialist absolutism in service of species survival, implemented through sophisticated manipulation of causal chains across extended time horizons, executed through compartmentalized networks that obscure the full scope of his operations. This is the methodology of Eldrad Ulthran, and it has shaped galactic history in ways that few fully comprehend, and even fewer could hope to replicate.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.